Good morning, members. Welcome to session 4 of budget scrutiny. I'm conscious that Councillor Nicholson's not in his seat yet, but there's no apologies from today, so I suspect he may just be late. In terms of session 4, may I welcome Councillor Sudan and Councillor Penberthy, perhaps just to assist all the members of this panel before we commence with your presentation and scrutiny. Perhaps if we go through introductions, starting with you, Giles, please. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair. I'm Giles Perrott. I'm the Assistant Chief Executive.
A member for HR, OD, who forgot to put a microphone on, Sport and Leisure, Transformation and IT, and Customer Services.
Thank you. I'm Chris Squire, recently appointed Service Director for HR and Organisational Development.
Very well.
Thank you.
Hello, Rachel Surcott, Community Empowerment Lead. I'm here on behalf of Ruth Harron.
Councillor Chris Penberthy, Cabinet Member for Housing, Cooperative Development and Communities, and a whole load of other things that aren't in the title.
Good morning, Jackie Kings, Strategic Manager for Community Connections.
And Gary Warbridge, the Interim Strategic Director for People.
Helen Slater, Lead Accountancy Manager for Community Connections.
Thank you very much. A very warm welcome. It's been brought to my attention that, Gary, you need to depart slightly ahead of schedule today for a personal commitment. Thank you. Just please slip out when it's your time to go. Very keen to hear from you, Councillor Dannett and Councillor Penberthy, on the following caveats. I've been trying to marshal the sessions, and I know historically, from experience, you're not one who goes on for too long, Councillor Penberthy or Councillor Dan. You're very succinct. So I'm looking forward to that. Oh, wow. On a page. There are a number of members who are very keen to put questions to you in respect of the draft budget before us. So in order to give members sufficient time to table those questions, I would be grateful if we did try and keep it as brief as we can. There's more to be gained out of the questioning. So over to you, Councillor Dan, and then perhaps we'll hear from Councillor Penberthy. Thank you.
Okay, I'll give a quick run through the areas of the portfolios. They are quite wide-ranging. So the smallest one in terms of budget is the leisure budget, and basically we manage the leisure centres across the city, and we have a small amount of money that we use for development of activities. And we also do a lot of commissioning work and partnership work, working with partners across the city in terms of the Active Thrive agenda. So that's the smallest part of the budget. I also manage the HR and OD support services. I think the thing about this portfolio is that it is an enabling portfolio. The things that are in the budget enable the council to do its functions across all departments of the council. In terms of HROD, there are budget pressures. There was a budget saving this year, which we have not made, because if we have made it, we would not have been able to function as an organisation, and that has been covered elsewhere in the directorate. And moving forwards, HROD, it's really important that we maintain the current level, because that's how we are going to manage recruitment, it's how we're going to manage retention, it's how we're going to manage workforce development, bring on new talent, retain our staff, develop apprenticeship routes. So that's that part of the budget. The transformation and governance part of the budget and IT, again, there are challenges in that budget as well. IT is what enables the councils to function, and it's a very different arena now than it was 10 years ago. We have more staff, we have more things that we have to deal with, things like cybersecurity, so there are increased pressures to deliver and keep the council safe within a tight budget. And then the last one is customer services, customer focus, business support. This is the service that keeps all the back office across the council running. There are pressures, Over the last couple of years, there were massive cuts. There was £300,000 taken out of the budget last year, and there was 188 which was to come out this year, which we have not met, but has been covered off across other areas of corporate services. And the reason it's not been met is because it would have been taking people out of a service that covers everyone else in the council. And as you know from the last full council, there is also a lot of pressure on us to make sure that we deliver services more effectively and more openly to members of the public, and that's what customer service is, the customer experience is. And we need to look at ways across all of those portfolio areas of managing demand and looking at process so that we can deliver a service within budget. You've got all the figures in front of you. And the other part of my portfolio, so this is why Rachel's here as well, is not just the sports development, is that we also had the role of delivering on the cost of living action plan. That was a very small budget, it was £25,000, and it's been used mainly for advertising and promoting all the things across the city, not just from the council, but from all our partners, about how we are supporting our residents within the cost of living crisis. So that's a quick overview of where we are and some of the challenges that we are facing.
Thank you, Councillor Dan. Councillor Penberthy?
Thank you, and just a quick run through of my portfolio, starting at the back and moving forward. The bits that aren't covered but a headline you might want to talk about are corporate property performance and procurement. I also have within the community stream the whole area of community engagement and cohesion, the voluntary community sector, the armed forces covenant, equalities, diversity and inclusion, the benefits for which the council is responsible for, and our approach to anti-poverty, which is linked to cost of living, but is the longer term perspectives as well. There's more in there, but that's a headline. In terms of cooperative development, the whole area of cooperatives, mutuals, social enterprises and their role in the city, the inclusive growth agenda, including the Plymouth Charter, community use of council assets, community asset transfers, all of that sort of stuff, working with Tudor on that. And then housing in all its sort of multitudinal aspects. Rather than going through all of that, Chair, because that would take a long time, you did specifically highlight homelessness. So I thought I'd particularly talk about homelessness and then leave the rest to questions. So over the last few years, homelessness has been on the rise. We've seen the number of households approaching the council rise from 2,404 in 2019-20, and we're forecasting over 3,700 this year. The increased demand is leading to increased numbers in emergency accommodation, and alongside that we've seen a rise in the cost of nightly paid accommodation, which has led to a current overspend this year. This is not a Plymouth specific issue, it's a national pressure, and you'll see whenever you hear stuff about pressures on local government, adults, children's and homelessness are the three that are cropping up absolutely everywhere. And that's because households continue to be affected by national challenges, such as the cost of living crisis, which has impacted their ability to meet day-to-day costs and leading to more people threatened with homelessness. But also there are issues around potential changes to rental legislations, which are meaning landlords are leaving the market, together with increased costs of being a landlord, which means that it's no longer necessarily financially viable in all cases for landlords to be landlords, so they're leaving the market, putting pressure on us. Our city has an unusual housing mix in terms of tenures, which means the private rented sector takes a disproportionate importance in the city. In response to this, we have set up a housing task force, which I co-chair with Tracy Lee, and a homelessness recovery board chaired by Matt Garrett, to help drive a homelessness recovery plan, as well as the development of a brand new plan for homes version 4, to see us through the next 5 years of all of our housing agenda. We're working with partners across the council and the wider city to look at alternative forms of temporary accommodation, to not only reduce the numbers in emergency accommodation, but also to improve the standard of accommodation offered. We've worked with our teams and the Plymouth Alliance to increase our homelessness prevention by helping people to remain in their current tenancies or where they are living or to secure new tenancies. We've worked to bring on temporary accommodation to replace expensive nightly paid accommodation such as bed and breakfast and Airbnb. And we are driving additional plans to deliver new affordable accommodation in the city, the first of which we announced last week. There's a lot of great work happening from our team and our partners, and we're starting to see some green shoots in terms of how we go forward, but there is a hard road ahead of us. Because of the overspends in the last 2 years, where budgets have been set based on the previous year's budget rather than previous year's performance, we asked for a growth of £3.2 million at the point of the MTFP. I'm pleased that the council responded and have actually put that into the budget, together with an additional £1 million delivery plan. I need to be clear that whilst I'm confident we can do that, that is not without significant challenge. But this is a budget that the service can work with to meet the demands that we're facing. And I'm very happy to take questions on any areas of my portfolio, but thought that given you'd asked questions, I'd give you a bit of padding on the homelessness. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Members, over to you. First on the list is Councillor Tippett.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is for Councillor Dan. I know that there's been a lot of discussion at the moment about making sure that everyone can access the council services. So I was wondering what we're doing to support people with poor digital access to make sure that they can get the help that they need from us.
This is a very complicated picture because what we're trying to do is invest in ways in which we can increase people's access into the council so they can do it themselves digitally. We've already invested money into the website so that when people come into the website, it's much easier for them to negotiate their way around, and there's continuing work on some of the high volume areas so that it gets easier. And we know that works because we can see that when people come onto the website, they spend less time on the website as they get to find out what they're looking for. So if you take something like school admissions, for instance. So that's one area. We also know that, and this has been enhanced through COVID, that people have moved towards digital access because they've had to. Because during COVID, you couldn't come into the council. It was more difficult to use telephone lines just because of the way we were working. So if you think that now, approximately every single month, there are about 20,000 interactions on the website by members of the public and councillors, which is an incredible shift from having all those phone calls coming in. So that's one way, so it's making it easier. But we still have to make sure that people who are not digitally able are also able to access services. So it's not perfect. It's still, I can say, a work in progress. So if you go through the telephone when you ring up now, there is a line at the bottom which says, if you're not able to access digitally, then do contact us here. And I think since we've started this, we've had about 10,000 calls. A third of those are people who have been redirected to be able to do things digitally. It's just because they didn't know how or they needed instruction. And what we're trying to do is make sure that for the people we know who need digital support, we get through to them a lot quicker. So it's a mixed bag. It's also about looking at how we, how can I put this? How we manage demand, because there are only so many people answering the telephones at any one time. And just by changing the system, we've already reduced the average waiting time and the average number of people that hang up a lot over the last 3 or 4 months. But it's something we have to try and do and manage people's expectations. And of course, to do that, you need people. So last year, there was £300,000 taken out of the budget, and there was a target of another 188 this year, which we've just not been able to deliver. Because if we had, those are people. Those are people who are not answering queries, who are not answering the phone, who are not supporting in a business support thing right across the council. So I think that sort of answers your question. We need to do and look at ways of how we can increase demand and manage demand more effectively. And part of that is through the digital process.
Thank you. Councillor Riley.
Hi, thank you, Chair. My question is for Councillor Penberthy. I just wondered if you could tell us the current rough sleeper numbers, and off the back of that, is a £1 million target saving achievable?
Yeah, I'll just flick through my papers to get the one as of last night, but I think it was about 15 or 16. Numbers fluctuate between about 10 and 20 a night. It changes night to night, but we're in that sort of ballpark. In terms of the £1 million being achievable, I think, yes, it is. We're doing a whole load of things that take money out of bed and breakfast, which is very expensive and which we get very little support from the government from. I think it's around 16% of the cost of bed and breakfast comes back to us into other forms of temporary accommodation, longer term temporary accommodation on licence. That means that we're able to have that as supported housing, and depending on the model, have anything from 80 to 100% of the costs met by housing benefit. One of the ways we're going to do that is by, as long as Cabinet approve and it doesn't get called in and we're able to then start spending, £10 million on buying family housing. That will mean that we can take families out of bed and breakfast, hotels, Airbnbs, and other temp and put them into longer term temp, which will be a lot cheaper for us. So although that's a £10 million expenditure, the savings will be substantial. So we've got a number of plans like that. So that's the first we've announced. We're working at business cases on others at the moment. As those come in, that's where we see the £1 million being saved. We've also supported a number of applications which we had to make, but there's all sorts of partnerships doing them on the SHAP programme, which is the supported housing programme the government announced recently. That would bring a whole load of other temporary accommodation into use, though some of that would be new builds, so will take longer. Others are refurbs and purchase, so will be quicker. So we can see not only £1 million next year as achievable, and we have a plan for it, which is really good to have, but we can see how in the long term that will also begin to change the way we do work with homelessness, away from nightly pay to longer term, and away from us having to subsidise the cost to actually it being a housing benefit covering the costs, which is useful for us, and actually provides a better facility for people who are having to access homelessness services than they currently have. So we're starting with families because we think that's the priority. In our first set of spend, there's a lot of single people accommodation in the SHAP bids, and we will be continuing to move those forward. We're also working with people like Young Devon and Path to support them acquiring other premises. And as those begin to come online, those will save money. Similarly, the new Trevi House will be saving some money going forward into next year. We've already factored some of those savings this year into this year's forecast outturn.
Thank you. Councillor Stevens.
Thank you, Chair. And this is to Councillor Penberthy as well. Related to housing, there's the ambition laid out for additional housing across the city, but given the economic slump and drag and cost of living crisis, what's the risk of houses not being built on schedule, which then leaves under occupancy and perhaps not the anticipated income from community tax, council tax and so on, so those people not be able to move into new houses, but also there's a delay in freeing up other houses for some of the issues that you raised just now with homelessness.
I think when you look at new builds, there are a number of different markets you need to consider. So we know that the volume house builders are slowing down because they're driven by a bottom line. At the same time, we are doing what we have done in the past, which is incentivise the parts of the market we can incentivise. So, for example, Bath Street, which got planning permission last week, we've been involved in the land assemblage on that. We are actually supporting some of the costs, together with Homes England and PCH. They will therefore be going out, they've appointed builders, they will be getting on. So actually the slowdown in some of the private market helps us kickstart mixed tenure schemes with a lead from social housing. That means that our affordability numbers are higher, and the affordability numbers we achieve on the sites that we engage with in terms of land acquisition or land release are closer to 60% affordable in the total mix, as opposed to the open market mix without those sites, which is at less than 17%. So actually the affordability still depends on what we do, and we will be driving that. We are currently looking at what sites we can bring forward. The team are working with over 40 sites at the moment, some of them ours, some of them other people's, to try and bring them forward. We are doing another land review to see if we can identify further plots of land that will be housing, that's small housing. There are sites in the joint local plan that we know we will want to progress in order to meet our land supply, which is still at over 5 years. We've just had the latest figures in, which is good news, but we need to be developing those sites. Otherwise that land supply falls and we're open to appeal on any planning decision that we refuse. We don't want that because that gives builders the ability to do bad things. So we are currently master planning land at West Park, so Stoggy Lane as it's known, that's in the joint local plan. But we are taking a greater control of that master plan. We're not selling it in order to meet more housing need. Similarly, we're looking at sites that we own, such as the Register Office site, which is another one that has been sitting around for a long time. We want to bring those forward. And those will look at much more direct delivery models. We've been experimenting and learning on some small sites on direct delivery, and we're going to begin to move those forward. Part of that is that we're looking into the future and saying, where might government go? Not just this government, but if there's a change of government. And one of the things we always have to do is that sort of parallel track. It's quite clear that if there's a change of government, there would not only be support for registered providers to build, but also additional support for councils to build council housing. And so we're now looking at whether we need to reopen the housing revenue account, and if so, what that means. So before we release more sites, we're just making that decision, because if we become a registered, well, we're already a registered provider, but if we become a council with housing stock, then that changes things. So before we do land releases, we're just checking that. But that means we can intervene in the market, we can support trades, and actually for those volume builders at the moment, if the £10 million gets through the process, what we've said is the first port of call is new build houses, because they've got 10-year guarantees on them. So we're actually looking to see if we can support some of those volume builders to keep building by going in and buying some of their housing stock. So there are lots of interventions we can make. Plan for Homes 4 is looking at all of those. And I've asked officers to liaise with Democratic Support and Councillor Bingley to see whether we can get pre-decision scrutiny on that in the February meeting of his panel, because that's due to go to Cabinet in March. So that's the pace we're working at in order to be able to work at incentivising the market.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up, please, Chair? It's great news last night that as Plymouth is a welcoming city, we look forward to welcoming some additional refugees to the city coming soon. So I'd like to know how they will be accommodated and what support will they have with whichever partnerships to be supported into work, which will help them to develop community cohesion and able to earn an income and then put back into the city tills as well. Thank you.
Okay, so just to give you some idea, over recent years, we've, as a city in the private rented sector, through the generosity of people in the city, accommodated 191 people from the Ukraine, and that's been a really successful scheme. Those are now people moving from their original host families into the private rented sector and other forms of housing. That's how that one works. through the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Policy and the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, which are both part of the ones that we signed up to, as long as it's not called in, yesterday. I'm always caveating decisions that are not yet finally signed off. And that's 55 people that we've welcomed so far from that scheme in 12 families. We've also welcomed people through Syria as well, but giving you some idea, at 55 people in 12 families in the private rented sector, LHA rates, actually 30 people over the next year is likely to be between 6 and 8 families in the private rented sector. It's not a lot. The government gives us quite generous funding for the first 5 years to support integration. Part of that goes into our refugee support services, what was RIS. We're currently recommissioning that work. That includes support for integration, language, employment, housing over the 5 years of that scheme. The advantage is that the money from the government enables us to do that for other refugees in the city as well, so that we're able to offer a better service. And obviously some of the people who are dispersed here as asylum seekers will choose to stay in Plymouth. So we're able to use some of that money for other refugee schemes to support them to integrate and to get employment. Through all of that, we work with really strong partnerships. And there's lots of players out there. I'm consciously not going to name any of them now because we are going through a procurement process. So I don't want to say this is exactly what it is, but there are names that people recognise in the city who are doing amazing work. If we weren't here, I would be praising them by name. Please accept the fact I'm not. But that service is all there. And what we are seeing increasingly is people not only taking jobs, but setting up businesses. And if you certainly go into the bottom end of town, the number of businesses led by people who are, well, asylum seekers and refugees, now running food businesses and tailors and all sorts of other things that add to the life of the city, I think is really, really valuable. So yeah, it's a small number, but it's an important number. And I think it's something that cross-party we have been supportive of in trying to ensure that we remain a welcoming city and that we do our bit to support the country and the government as it brings refugees into the system.
Thank you. Notwithstanding the second question from Councillor Stevens, it's important, but it's a very small part of the budget, and it's not a risk to the budget because of funding. Going back to the first question in terms of the risk to the budget, in terms of the pipeline delivery, and you talked briefly about the risk, and this is budget scrutiny, so I'm very keen that we focus on budget scrutiny. We heard yesterday about the confidence, I think it's fair to surmise, in the pipeline from economic development. So just staying with Councillor Stevens' question, are you confident that you will be able to, is there confidence in your pipeline? Because if you're not confident, there's obviously clearly a risk to your portfolio in terms of delivery and income.
Yeah, I think the pipeline at the moment, when we're talking about housing, is probably less of the next 12 months than the future 24, 36, 48. And so looking into that window, at the moment, Persimmon on the major sites in the city, they're the major volume builder at the moment, are slowing down, but they have stuff coming out of the ground. Their slowdown is to finish that and not to break ground on a new house. Now, that's not going to impact the budgets for the next couple of years. Similarly, at Sherford, the same is happening. While all of that is happening, we are having very detailed conversations now with a whole load of providers, both Tudor and Mark in economic development, but also myself, meeting with some of the really big registered providers in the country, the ones that have got 80 to 100,000 housing units, talking about their investment potential in Plymouth, their ambitions. Part of that will link to the city centre, where we're talking about intensification, and we think that actually mixed tenure housing with an RP lead with Homes England backing will actually be the quickest way of delivering city centre regeneration, and it's why Homes England are supporting that master planning process. Similarly, Homes England are working on Coy Pool. And once they and Barrett sort the detail out, I think that one will happen quickly as well. So we're confident that whilst volume builders might slow down, we are doing stuff. As an example of that, Broadland Gardens in Dunstan, a 10-house direct delivery scheme, which won't be finished until March next year. We've already sold 4 of the 10. So if you build good quality housing, there is a market for it in the open market, and we know there's plenty in the affordable market that we can use.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify the impact on next year's budget, so I'm really grateful. Thank you. Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you, Chair. The 4 areas I'd like to touch on, perhaps we'll go back to Councillor Dan with customer services first, but also like to touch on travellers, more the strategic issues around homelessness, and then plan for homes for. So if we touch on customer services first through you, Chair, to Councillor Dan. So on page 15, paragraph 9.7, we're reminded that the Customer and Corporate Services Director has a net annual revenue budget of just over £50 million, of which 33 million is allocated for 2 core objectives: supporting the organisation and delivering customer service. So I welcome very much the announcement that Councillor Dan gave in relation to trying to assist those who are not digitally enabled. And I think we need to take into account all of us currently are digitally enabled, but as we get older, we may cease to become digitally enabled. So it's always going to be a requirement for people who become either have never been digitally enabled or will become digitally enabled because of age and infirmity. So looking at the budget. So of the 33 million, and you've clearly indicated that the budget inherited, Councillor Dan, had aspirations in it that are undeliverable. But of the current or the proposed budget for next year, how much is effectively going to be ring fence for activity that deals with digital inability to use the systems that are in place? Because I think we do need some dedicated resource to ensure that those people that are always never going to be able to use the system can access it. And I'm very pleased that you announced the fact that on the options on the telephone, which I'll try out later on, does give an option now for those to be able to select it. Because effectively when Councillor Beer and I went through it before the council meeting a week or so ago, you had to go through the cycle 3 times before you actually held the, I believe you hold the line, you get through eventually. And it's nonsense, you know, we should try and be efficient and give a dedicated option, and hopefully that will prove to be successful. So from a finance point of view, can you ring fence some money? Do you need some more money through us asking for more money to deal with this moving forward, please?
Right, from a budget perspective, we can only work with what we've got. Full stop. I mean, the budgets are so tight. If we could all ask for a little bit more to do a little bit more, that would be absolutely delightful, Councillor Nicholson, but I'm not falling down that trap because we will deal with what we've got. But what I was trying to explain is that people will try and get into the council as they can. So what we need to do is be able to free up some of the customer service, business support, so that customer experience for those who need extra help, or they might have complex needs. It might not be about being able to not contact the council digitally. It might be about someone in adult social care or children's social care or the housing department or somebody who's got debts or whatever, to have more specific support for that person. So it's not just about digital. So how are we going to do that? So we will be using digital technology to be able to speed up some of the processes, some of the administrative processes. So for instance, there's currently a couple of automated intelligence robot pilots being started in the council, where we can take routine administrative function from a person, give it to Bobby the robot to be able to do those invoicing and payment tasks, which then frees up people to be able to deal with some of the more complex needs. So that's how we need to think about how do we manage demand. with less people, but using technology wisely. Another example is blue badges are always an issue. Since COVID, the number of people applying for blue badges has gone up. We haven't got the resources to expand a team to fit demand. So let's be honest. But what we do need to do is think about how can we support those people who can't apply for a blue badge on their own more effectively. So it'll be starting off in a couple of the libraries where we will be able to, like we use Teams now, someone will be able to speak to someone on a laptop in a library. So rather than having to come into the central library, they'll be able to go to one of the smaller libraries and be able to work with the person on the screen to complete their blue badge form with somebody there, a library assistant, a customer service assistant, uploading the data. So we're using technology to think about how can we support people who need the extra help. And I suppose there is extra money going into that. I'm not going to say how much it will be because we've got 2 pilots running with autonomous, the IA now. We want to expand that into more places where we know we've got increased demand, but it's something that has to grow slowly. It's not one of those things where we're going to say we're going to stop people from working and put in a robot, because that is not the idea. The idea is to use technology to take away some of the regular administration so that the people can deal with people.
Okay, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you very much, Councillor Dan. So through you, Chair, perhaps one action, perhaps Councillor Dan could provide some benchmarking on what Plymouth's performance is like in customer services compared to comparable local authorities. And I'll use an example, and I'll declare an interest. My mother-in-law originally came from Surrey, has been moved to Plymouth in a residential home. She did renew her blue badge. It took 2 weeks through Surrey County Council. Effectively takes 3 months, I think, in Plymouth. So I think it would be useful to have some benchmarking data, actually, in terms of how we compare with comparable local authorities. So thank you very much, and I do look forward to obviously getting some positive feedback from elderly people.
Come back on one thing. So if you remember rightly, at the last full council, and I know this, we're talking about the budget, but I think this is an important thing to say, where I was asked what we were doing to support digitally excluded people. And I said that we are doing a lot and that our performance has really improved in many areas. There are still some challenges because we don't have the people. And I've just explained why some of the things with blue badges may be a little slower. But I would also like to have it on record that I did request that the whole area of the customer experience be referred to Scrutiny, because I really do feel that this is a really important issue that needs addressing.
You preempted what I was about to say. I'm very keen that we do scrutinise. This is the job we're here to do. Not only this year's position, but it's all about budget scrutiny. I think you raised some very good points, and I think that's probably more appropriate that comes through the performance management in terms of benchmarking and monitoring of my committee, which you've been before. I think it's and we discussed this last full council. So I think when we go through the recommendations, we can recap on that, but I think it's probably more appropriate. It comes back to scrutiny as opposed to budget scrutiny. You have some other questions, sir?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. So thank you, Councillor Dan, for those responses. So moving to Councillor Penberthy, if we could start on travellers, Councillor Penberthy, can you say what the actual costs, the actual spends were in 2022-23 and 23-24 financial years, or projected 23-24, and what your current budget allocation is likely to be for 24-25? And in those figures, or in the actual spends, an indication of what you might have spent historically on resilience hardening activities on difficult sites in the city. I believe this financial year there's no such provision. I think that was taken out by the Conservative administration last year in their proposed budget, which was endorsed by the Labour Party. And what you propose in terms of next year in relation to 24-25 resilience works, or any budget allocation, please?
Councillor Nicholson, as you well know, there is no such thing as a budget on Gypsy, Roma and Traveller or on unauthorised encampments. The nature of each encampment is different, and where we need to meet the budgets get met from across the a breadth of council departments, each out of their headlines. So legal cover it out of legal, parks cover it out of parks, highways cover it out of highways, community connections cover it out of our base staffing team. And so actually it gets caught up. It's not a separate budget line. It never has been. And actually it isn't sensible to say it will. Just to give some context, in both 21-22 and 22-23, we had 23 encampments a year. This year to date, and we're now out of season, so it's unlikely to change, we've had 14. So we have seen year on year, or we've seen a drop this year, but we've seen previous drops as well. So our targeted hardening is working, and it is continuing to happen. The plan is done on a site-by-site basis, and as we come to it, we try and put together funding packages for that, and those tend to be released with the support of ward councillors giving contribution from their councillor grant, as has happened, I think, on most of our targeted hardening. The identified priority sites to review this year include King George V playing fields, Coypool Park and Ride, West Park, Trevorleigh Gardens and St Mary's Park. So actually there is targeted hardening going on, once again with budgets being met from across bits of the council to support it according to what the needs are. So for example, King George V playing field is a parks issue, whereas Coypool is a highways issue. So different departments, and some departments will say we need to do things faster, but in doing targeted hardening, we need to ensure that the area remains welcoming for local residents, accessible for grounds maintenance, and where necessary, emergency vehicles. And some sites, and we know there's certainly one in Honicknoll and one in Sutton and Mount Gould, where we have a lot of unauthorised encampments, it's because it's almost impossible to target harden them unless we make them totally inaccessible for grounds maintenance and the public, and the ground maintenance matters because there are playing fields in there. So we are doing our best, but those ones that would cost vast fortunes, and those two would cost vast fortunes, we haven't got in the budget. But I am not able to say this is the budget line last year, this year, next year, or 5 years ago, or 5 years' time.
If I may, please, Councillor Nixon, I think it's a really interesting point, acknowledging that it transcends across a lot of budgets across the organisation. I think there's probably some work for performance finance scrutiny to where we could drill down to see what the impact in each of those budgets are, not necessarily because there's no budget line for this in next year's budget, but there's an impact on many departmental budgets, and I wonder if that's work that we could undertake on performance management as part of our workflow in understanding the true financial impact. Whilst it's encouraging to see the number of unauthorised encampments declining, but that's not a true real understanding of what the actual costs are to the organisation. But I think that's probably more appropriate for the normal work of performance management scrutiny as opposed to budget, because as you say, there's no actual budget for this. But
well,
we can
I'm
talk
not
about
sure I
that
would
later.
agree with that,
Okay.
Chair, with the greatest respect. I think could be a cop-out because it defers the issue. I think actually the public would want their politicians to be able to account for all expenditure by the local authority, and I think there should be an action, and we can discuss it after.
I agree with you.
I think
no, just a second, as chair, I agree with your point about absolutely right. The public want to make sure that this local authority are spending money wisely, and we are being prudent, and politicians are standing up and being accountable for that. But what's clearly difficult is that there's no one line in this budget that we can point to say, hang on, there it is. We need to do further work to drill down in each department so we actually understand. I think that's the problem, and that's not going to be achievable looking at next year's budget because it's hidden in other departments. Not hidden, wrong word. It impacts in other departments. The example you gave is legal, for example. I think there's more work that could be done to say, what is the impact? So I respectfully disagree, but let's move on to your next question.
Well, no, if I can just finish that point, because we're in December, we're not going to set a budget until sometime in February, and we have an array of accountants in each of the departments could actually do some work in the next month, drawing together actual spends in the different departments on areas affected by gypsy travellers. So I think it's a challenge that we can come to it, but I think it's a challenge that should be dealt with before we set the budget, because it actually should be possibly an opportunity for the council to set Councillor Benberthy with a budget line to deal with this and actually pull the cost into one budget head rather than have them dispersed across the council. So we can discuss it later. Thank you, Councillor Benberthy, for that response. As the Cabinet member ultimately responsible for dealing with gypsy traveller incursions in the city, are you content with the approach that the local authority is currently taking in dealing with this matter? And are you content from a budgetary position that your policy or the policy of the council that you've inherited as the Cabinet member puts the local authority at the forefront of taking responsibility for this and not necessarily using legislative provisions which actually do pass some of the burden potentially on the local area, on Devon and Cornwall Constabulary?
I think this is getting well beyond budget. In terms of budget, I am content that it is probably better that rather than taking budget from lots of departments in the council, giving it to Community Connections in order for Community Connections to be recharged by all those departments on an hourly basis is probably the best use of what is a small and reactive budget impact across lots and lots of areas. I think that's probably the best use of the budget spending. In terms of other things, the police powers are about criminal activity, and criminal activity leads them to them using their powers. If they don't use their powers, we use ours, and all of that is set out in legislation. All we do and the police do is follow the legislative guidance that was set down for us nationally, and therefore that also indicates the costs that we incur and the police incur in handling it. But I don't think it is helpful now to go into commentary on all of those processes.
All right, thank you. I'm keen. Do you have another question?
Yeah, happy to accept that. Perhaps I'll just move straight to Plan for Homes 4. So, Councillor Benberthy, obviously you've experienced in post, having undertaken the role for many, many years in different periods, and you'll be aware, having agreed, along with all members of the council, the joint local plan, which prioritised development on brownfield sites rather than greenfield sites, and taking cognizance of your response to colleagues in relation to build-out rates on the existing joint local plan development sites, principally Sherford and many of the big volume house builders, slowing. Is it still your priority to concentrate development on brownfield sites rather than greenfield sites?
Chair, I'm sorry, could I intervene? I'm struggling to find out what this has got to do with the budget.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Perrott, for intervening. But we did have in the introduction, Councillor Benberthy touched on the plan for homes, which does have a financial implication on the council. So I haven't actually got to ask the question, Mr. Perrott, if you don't mind me just completing.
I'm quite content for you to complete your question, and we'll hear from the Cabinet member.
Thank you. So from a strategic point of view, are you still prioritising brownfield sites over greenfield sites? And so that would be the first question. And the second point, is the budget take into account land sales that involve greenfield sites?
The sites we're prioritising are the sites in the joint local plan, because those are the sites that are allocated for housing. And so that's where we will continue to put our time and effort. But in terms of if the council releases land for housing for sale, that under a previous plan for homes I set up, the revenue or the capital received goes into the Housing Investment Fund to support the delivery of more affordable housing in the city. It's joined by asbestos contingency relief for Plymouth Community Home Stock, Section 106 off-site affordable housing, the profits from Broadland Gardens. So that is where all of that money ends up in order to deliver housing, but it's only on the basis of land sale. So for example, we made no money on Douglas House because it was a direct delivery of affordable housing on our own land.
I'm grateful, thank you.
Indeed,
Thank you. Councillor Bingley, before I move on to the next speaker, we strayed into matters where you may have a personal interest you wish to declare. Thank you.
I do. I heard Devon and Cornwall Police mentioned. My wife works for Devon and Cornwall Police, but I won't be speaking anywhere near that area. I kind of almost.
Sorry, just Councillor Bingley, I was dealing with your interest. You're further down my list.
Oh, right,
I'll come
okay.
to you in a moment.
Okay. Sorry.
But I admire your ambition to get in there. I've got Councillor Poyser.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep my questions rather succinct and to the point, because they do follow off the back of Councillor Tippett's and Councillor Nicholson's questions. First one's in relation to the housing build programme that Councillor Penberthy mentions. We're looking at the non-treasury investment document yesterday, which looks at a commercial property net income, and it's forecast for 24-25 at 2.456 million. I was just wondering, would it be possible to have some more detail on what those incomes are? And
That's actually commercial property, so it's Councillor Evans and Councillor Lowry. It's not housing.
So that's not investments, as in land investments. That
no, that's covered from the Housing Investment Fund.
Whereabouts would those incomes be then? Where would
the capital programme puts a figure, but doesn't give the full breakdown of everything. But the figure on the Housing Investment Fund is in the capital programme.
Okay, that's useful to know. So there's still income coming in from the sale and release of land. Would it be possible to see where that is for next year's budget? Because that obviously has an impact upon the house building programme and investment.
This isn't something that you would normally cover. This is normally Councillor Lowry.
Well, no, actually, the Housing Investment Fund is mine because it's if we're releasing corporate estates, I'm responsible for corporate estate. But so it's not Treasury management, it is something different. However, we aren't yet budgeting any land sales in the capital programme next year because we are not at the moment planning on releasing any land next year. At the point we do, the money goes into the Housing Investment Fund and we then allocate that on an ad hoc basis or towards existing partnership agreements. So, for example, recently I have signed off support of £11,000 per home for the viability gap on affordable housing on the North Prospect Library site. That's come out of that pot. So the money that comes in is recycled as if it's a bigger sum for recycling, it'll go in the capital programme as a distinct line. If it's a smaller one like that doesn't actually hit the parameters, it won't necessarily appear there. So, but at the moment, we are not budgeting for land sale next year. That might change, and if it does, that's how it will be handled at the point of the quarterly report on the capital programme to full council.
Thank you for that response, Councillor Penberthy. I think that's important for us to know because it does have budgetary implications. So you've been very clear about that response. I do have one other question as well, if that's entirely possible, and that is in relation to actually two. Very briefly, we were talking about unauthorised encampments a moment ago. I don't want to go back there. I think there's something in there for unauthorised access that we can talk about at the next session, where we talk about parks budgets. So that'd be useful. We could hold that. So another question, just Councillor Dan, in relation to accessibility. As you mentioned, at the last full council meeting, Councillor Salmon raised this motion and we did debate it and we were going to go back to scrutiny on those particular issues. I have had some issues with residents not having written correspondence back to them. And I was just wondering, in the budget, what kind of allocations have we got for those types of engagement? And I appreciate we're trying to push people more towards a digital culture. So the first question is around what is our allocations in terms of resource for us to actually provide written responses to those that provide a response, because we seem to be struggling. And the other question is maybe in relation to Chris, it's a similar thing, is that as we're trying to encourage more people to use online services, is there any training provision for older residents and what access to hardware might they be? So maybe funding allocated to training provisions in that area.
I'm not sure I can directly answer either of those questions. So the first one, it feels like a bit like a casework thing, if I'm really honest, Councillor Poyser, and perhaps we could talk about it offline because I don't understand where the written communication should have come from. So without understanding more, because one would hope that whatever medium the person came into the council, whether it was written, email, phone, on, you know, through the website, that the response would come back in the same way or be directed to be a different way. I don't know, so I can't answer the question. And I don't know whether it's a customer experience, customer hub question, or whether it's in a particular department like, I don't know, adult social care or housing, where it becomes a business support response. So I can't answer the question without understanding more of what you mean. So that's the first thing. And then it would be, and then would be able to sort of talk about where the resources are lying. That's the first one. In terms of the second one, I'm being very careful with my words here, because when people come through and we are encouraging people, if they can, to be able to report them themselves through using the online system, they are sort of semi-directed when they come in on the telephone. In terms of actual support, in terms of how to do it physically, I think that could happen in a load of organisations. So, for instance, if you go to community centres, there are job hubs, you can go to the library, you can get IT support. So it's not directly funded through the council, but through lots and lots of different partners. We must all have partners within our community bases, within our own, wards. I know that there is help for the digitally excluded. So again, it's not going to be a functional line within our budget, but I'm pretty sure that some of the commissioning that we do through Live Well and through the libraries that they're up, and Adult Ed, there will be lots of ways that people can be digitally supported.
I'm very keen to explore that further through performance scrutiny, performance finance scrutiny, because customer service is a fundamental part. It's on our workflow. We talk about it each time, and we could interrogate that further in that arena. Councillor Bingley, you're next on the list.
Thanks. I'm sorry to sort of rehash on customer services, and I think both administrations over the years have struggled in some way. You know, it's one of these things, particularly post-COVID, because we don't quite know how the audience or the market settles down. One of the concerns that we had last year when we were setting budget was around the performance of Delt. I'm going to be brutally honest. And so it wasn't so much that we were cutting the budget, it was that we were looking at a huge amount of money being spent on not a great customer service return. And a lot of us councils speak with other local authorities, whether it's through the LGA or whether we've just got connections. So I think there was a feeling among members, not just in one party, but across the board, that the people of Plymouth could get better value for money. And therefore, when we were pressed with this abnormal budget setting last year, it was 37.5 million deficit, not a 2.41 that we're seeing this year. And when we were pressed with that, we obviously had to be pragmatic and look at that budget and to deflate it somewhat. So what I'm saying is that there is a different interpretation, that you could say, wow, we're actually spending a lot of money, many millions of pounds, on something that's not giving the functionality to our target audience. And so one of the things that was requested, I believe, as part of last year's budget, and is written down on paper, is that we action a comparative review. In other words, we don't just look at Delt and examine that, but we actually look at a couple of other potential service providers that other councils had talked about and were raving about, frankly. I think one may have been Surrey, but it was certainly in that area. So just to maybe say or urge, my question is, will you be conducting a comparative review? That's my sort of first question, or could we please maybe document that? The second thing is that one of the key frustrations from our audience since I got elected in 2021 is people saying your website doesn't work. So one of the roles of the council, you kind of feel like you're a bit like a website administrator, because you're sort of putting in these emails saying this link doesn't work or whatever. So it was just a feeling of a lack of grip of the actual website customer service functionality. I think both sets of members have got that. So therefore, can we have an audit, a functionality audit is what I'm asking for, is that actually every line, every column and line is gone through on that website, and that the links actually work and click through into where they're meant to click through into. I'm not sure that was done. It's something that was sort of informally asked for, I think, from many councillors that have been in Sue's position, Councillor Dan's position. So can those two things happen? Or what's her thoughts on that?
Before you come in, performance and management scrutiny was setting up a select committee for the contract renewal, which is due to take place next year for Delt, or perhaps another provider. So that's already on our workflow, but I'd be very interested in hearing Councillor Dan's response. But we acknowledge that we've requested that select committee, and we're still looking for volunteers. I wouldn't want to lose that opportunity.
So I'll come to the website first, because I think I said earlier when we were talking about digital access, how we've already spent quite a lot of money already going through the website, and I signed off more money not that long ago, so we keep going through the lines. So I just happen to have in front of me the digital services report of people's accessing the website for the last April, May, June to October. And that's where I said there are approximately 20,000 access points. And there are 300 service lines that have gone through. So with the modernisation of the website, I am not a digital person, so I'm only talking about how it works, so please don't ask me any technical questions. They've gone through the most used functions of the website to make sure that they are as green as possible, so therefore they are not over embellished with lots and lots of photographs, and that they are simple and it works. And I think a good example of how it works when it's properly done is if you go onto the cost of living hub. As far as I know, we've had brilliant response from that, because you go in there, you can see the different pillars, you can see what is being on offer, and as you go through, it gives you what you've been signposted to with an active link, which links through to partner organisations. So it's not just working with what we can do in the council, it's also work with our partners across the city. Now, I agree with you, for instance, that the website isn't sometimes the easiest thing. And what I've done is that when people have put in their, copied me into customer service complaints about access to the website, about how people haven't been able to find something, we go back in and we look at the language, because quite often we're all working in a council, we've all got council speak. It isn't how people of the public see things. So if we talk about, let me just think, a replacement bin, for instance, you have to think, what would a member of the public want? What would they put in the search bar at the top to get a replacement bin or report a missed bin? I'm just picking easy ones, but it's not always that easy. So I take on board. So in terms of, if you hear of people accessing the website and things don't work, you need to let us know. And also, if people can't find things on the website, you need to let us know, because that's will then help reduce the number of calls that come into people on the telephone, which then frees up lines for people who can't do it. So that's the first thing about the website. There is investment and it's ongoing. The second question is around Delt. More complicated, because Delt is actually one of the Plymouth City Council's family of companies. We actually own it. So we outsourced it in terms of putting out, for those of us who were councillors many, many years ago, you'll know that IT in the councils can also always be dodgy, and sometimes you have to look at how you invest. So we outsourced it, so that we outsourced it to a company that is full of IT specialists. The contract is coming up for review in the next over the next year, and it's 10 years ago that the contract was first made, so it's a 10-year-old contract. And you think how the world has moved on digitally in 10 years, it's absolutely enormous. So if things like cybersecurity, for instance, it costs us 10 times as much now to make our system safe than the budget that was drawn up 10 years ago. 10 times, we spend 10 times more money. And this is why the IT budget is under pressure. So it is coming up for review. And I think it is a time to make sure that we get that client-customer relationship managed better, and so that it's more of a two-way conversation. And we need it, because we need to innovate more. We need to use IT in a more innovative way, as I've said before, to manage the extra demand. So I'm sort of agreeing with what you're saying about how we need to look at how we review the DELT work.
I think, are you coming in again?
Just briefly, Chair, cyber security was mentioned. I'm the director of a cyber security training organisation. It has no involvement in Plymouth, but I'll just be transparent about that. And I won't talk in my sort of supplementary around that. It was, but my point was, I understand all of that. I completely agree. Probably, if it's not already been done, a functionality audit, which is it's an overall, there will be software applied.
Yeah.
A dedicated team would just go through. It doesn't take very long to just check every link. And is sort of working and going to the right place, and that actually it just there's a functionality of like 100%. There's not things sort of missing. I'm sure it's done already, but just to table that.
Yeah.
Councillor Bingley, you are volunteering, I think, to assist us with our select committee review. It is a massive piece of work that this committee will be driving next year. The renewal from DELT, it cannot be understated. It transcends every aspect of what the local authority delivers. It's fundamental to our future financially and everything from customer services to joining up the dots. It's a massive piece of work, and I know an email has gone out. We are very keen that members take part in that select review because it's fundamental to our financial success and our success generally to provide the services for residents. So I'd be very keen for your involvement in that because you clearly come from a place of experience. Councillor Carlisle.
Thank you, Chair. Just through permission from you, Chair, I've got two questions. I've got one for Councillor Down's portfolio and one for Councillor Penberthy's portfolio. One of the ones for Councillor Down, I'm not sure if you can answer, if I'll be speaking to Chris Squire, is looking at the flashcard for October, and on page 36. So we're looking at the customer and corporate services workforce. I noticed that we are spending quite a lot on the agency workers, and we're looking at, so it's 110,000 per month for October, full-year forecast of over £1 million. And also, again, we're seeing the sickness is quite increased with customer and corporate services, which obviously having an impact, and that our agency spend has increased. So part of the budget, I'm just wondering, what are we doing to address that? Are we doing something, because I know with children's services, we spend a lot on agency, so we are then trying to do a big recruitment drive. Are we trying to do a recruitment drive? And if so, have we allocated spend in the budget for that side of it? So that's my first question. Do you want me to wait for them to answer, Chair? And then I'll ask. Yeah. Yep, lovely.
Let's start off quickly about agency spend, because this is something that has been looked at right across the council. And I just want to sort of manage people's expectations. We will always need agency workers. There's never going to be a point where the council doesn't have agency workers, because sometimes they are used as the right option for a service. So, for instance, in street services during the summer, when we have extra need for people to be out and about, cutting grass, managing things where it goes up, we will always have the agency spend because it's the best way of managing a services budget. I think one of the things that has been happening here is where we've used agency spend as well, where we haven't been able to recruit. So that's also a way that we have to use it, otherwise we can't function as a council. So I know, for instance, in a couple of my business support areas where we've got agency spend because we had a uplift in inquiries following COVID, and we had to get rid of the backlog. So it's not a permanent peak, it's a peak that's come because of a reason. So we have agency spend in there to bring the backlog down so we can get down to business as usual. So that's in terms of an operational answer. I'll now hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Councillor Carlisle, and I'm sure you appreciate I might not have all the detail after 3 weeks here, which I've greatly enjoyed, I've got to say. Thank you for that. In terms of the customer and corporate services flashcard, sickness absence rate is actually below the corporate average, but you'd expect that in that kind of with the services that are represented there as well. You'll also note that's above the UK average for sickness absence, so UK PLC in effect. So there is room there as well. In terms of the linking that back to agency and interim as well and recruitment, I think it was the totality of the question. At the top level, I think we have recruited now to, we had 6 vacancies for the senior leadership team. We've recruited permanently to 3 of those now. So interims have left as a result of that, my post being one of those. So spend there is indeed coming down. We are focusing, and this is work I've already started, and well, we continued with it. We're increasing the attention on things such as apprentices, bringing younger people, returners to the workplace and such like into the workforce, making sure we utilise our levy absolutely fully on that. And we're having conversations as well with our skills and post-16 development team in children's services around some of that activity as well. So expecting that to increase. Figures aren't bad across the organisation, but we can do better. Certainly linking those into careers in customer corporate services, street services and such like. Absolutely fantastic. Sickness absence and interims are both, you'll see from the flashcards, that reported to the corporate management team every month, and each strategic director working with their service directors has developed an action plan, again working with their HR partners, have developed action plans to reduce sickness absence, focusing on some of the kind of the longer term absentees and also the kind of frequent short-term absences as well. We report monthly on the top 100 absences and such like. So there's a big corporate focus on this at the moment. I would expect that figure to come down, and then from there we need to look at some of the more. We need to review the well-being support, and if you look at where the increases are, we're looking typically, and this matches the national scene, increases in absence due to mental well-being. And also musculoskeletal as well. So actually as an organisation, how are we supporting our staff? And I would also add our elected members around some of this as well. So we are focusing very heavily on that. I would expect the numbers to come down. Okay, thank you.
Can I just add one more thing as well? There are some restructures going on as well within organisation across the council, where some of the people who've been employed longer term on agency are being transferred into permanent posts.
Thank you. I was just wondering then, are we including in the budget the cost it might be for the support that we'll need? Because obviously, if we're especially with something like mental health and things like that, it's really important to offer that support. Is that being already included in the budget, or is that something you need?
It's funny, I had a health and safety update this week, and part of that is not just about trips, slips and falls, it's how we manage people's mental health. And as part of the review, we were looking at the employer assistance programme, which is very, very supportive in helping to support people with mental health or any other issues across within their life. It doesn't have to be about mental health, but yes, we do have processes in place.
Can I just and conscious I've got a public health colleague sat to my side here. We also need to look at the preventative rather than when people present with concerns here. So one of our focuses over the next few months will be around line manager training. So it's essential our line managers, our team leads and such like have the skills, the capability and the capacity to be able to work with their teams around some of these issues. There's an old saying, people leave managers, not organisations. So we need to make sure that actually our line managers feel equipped to be that first line for some of these issues as well. And that work is going on at the moment.
Just as a point of clarification, around this table and certainly throughout the council, I think there is confidence in terms of how we are managing absenteeism and people who back into the workplace. And we're monitoring that risk and we're seeing those reports more regularly. I think the question is, have we got sufficient resources built into your budget to make sure that we can provide for that? I think that's the question. We're very confident that this is being managed procedurally.
The answer to that question is we work with what we've got, Councillor Darcy, and as I said earlier, there were budget savings to be made this year within the HROD team, which have not been made because it would have meant that the team was unable to enable the rest of the council to have that proper HROD support.
Thank you. And then my question for Councillor Penberthy and your team. So obviously, as you know, I've got a very interest in children's services, being portfolio holder of Shadow. I'm just wondering with regards to homelessness. So when we're looking at the spend of that, is that including our under 25 care experience people, or is that coming under children's services budget, is one of my questions. And the second question is, obviously, as we know, there's an increased chance if you've been care experience, you will end up homeless. as a city with a protected characteristic, are we investing more into that side? Because I know we're saying we're looking after families primarily, but are we also investing more money into our care leavers who are also homeless?
In terms of, I'm just having a quick flick through, I'm going down the list of reasons for being homeless, and I'm getting quite a long way down and I've still not hit care leaving. So it's not one of our headline things. However, we are aware that young people are becoming homeless. And that's why we've worked with Young Devon explicitly around their housing, and why in the SHAP programme we've got temporary housing there. The reason we put family housing in is that family housing isn't covered by SHAP to the same level, and family housing is where we have the greatest demand, and it takes families out of bed and breakfast. That means children, pregnant women, but also children of school age, currently living in a hotel room with their parents, being given a home which they can base themselves at permanently until they find permanent accommodation. So temporarily permanent, if you see what I mean, which means children can settle in a school, parents can put a rigour around day-to-day life. So that's the reason for our 10 million, is that that is actually where we need the priority spend, and it's having the biggest impact on both budget and outcome. In terms of care leavers, this isn't the big thing, but we now have a member of the Children's Social Services team embedded within the homelessness work, so that what we're doing is when young people come in, that's all worked through, and we're working in partnership with the Zen. So we've got a whole load of wraparound, but as I said, care leaving isn't a big reason for homelessness. If care leavers come into the homelessness system and there are care leavers, we will do everything we can for them. But it's really not up there. In fact, I can't find it anywhere clearly on the list. So over the last few months, it's not been one of the presenting issues.
I think we were somewhat reassured yesterday. We also heard from Councillor Lang and Councillor Creswell, and this was discussed at quite some length with Gary as well yesterday. Do you have another question?
No, just a supplementary to that. I'm just wondering, so for the budget that we've got for homelessness, though, if they are under 25 with care experience, is that coming through your side from the homeless, or is it coming from the children's services? And also, I just think as a city, also just a little add-on, if we got the care leavers, care experienced people characteristic as a city, I think it would be quite good to maybe look into that. I don't know if you were actually asking people when they are homeless, were they care experienced? Because they could be in their 60s but have care experience, and obviously we know that that's had a massive impact, and it is normally percentage-wise across the whole of the nation. If you are care experienced, you do have that, but we might not. I don't know if we're asking that right question to it as well, to ensure that characteristic is protected.
Well, given that Devon Home Choice give priority for care experienced people, yes, we do ask the question, and we do give people a bump on the basis of that. So yes, we're asking the question. In terms of what it means when people come through the door, we will provide accommodation. There is a difference between a care experienced person under the age of 18 and a care experienced person over the age of 18. If it's under the age of 18, then that fits in children's services. If it's over age of 18, then that fits in our services. So it will depend on which age a child is, or a care experienced person is, when they come to us. I think we also need to be very cognizant of the fact that we will be concentrating much more in terms of care experience on younger care experienced people. We do a lot of support for veterans, but not all veterans with disabilities have their disabilities linked to the fact they served. So there are bits around, as people get older, understanding what's going on in people's lives before just jumping to conclusions. And we always try to understand what's going on in people's lives in order that they get the very best service. But if someone tells us they're care experienced, then we are already doing that. We were doing it before the council added it in as a protected characteristic.
That's fine. So we're looking at from 18 under will be children's services budget, and only because we obviously care experience, we look after them up to the age of 25 as corporate parents. But that's our cut-off with the regards of homeless. If they're 18 under, it'll be under children's services, and 18 plus will be under you guys.
Thanks, Councillor Caroline. Just in terms of care leavers coming through as homeless, there's a lot of work goes in place to make sure that young people in care don't come through as homeless at the age of 18 when they're leaving children's social care. They're supported at that point to access accommodation, so they don't come through at that point. Any point after that they are presenting as homeless, there's additional processes in place to support. So they are asked if they are care leavers. In terms of intentional homeless decisions, there's processes in place to make sure that they have additional support around that, so that everything is done, that isn't the final outcome, and they move on to accommodation. And as Councillor Penberthy said, there is then preference under Devon Home Choice for care leavers where they need it to be able to access accommodation with one of our registered providers.
Thanks, Jackie. Councillor Rainsford.
Thank you, Chair. We've obviously been hearing about some very big ticket items in terms of council spend. I want to drill down to something much smaller and ask Councillor Dan, looking at section 925, it talks about Plymouth Active Leisure. Only been in place since 2022, but it does apparently receive a significant subsidy from the council at present, and they're looking at new ways of working. And I wondered whether or not you could comment on whether they're looking for new ways to raise revenue, or whether they're being expected to make cuts.
Revenue is the answer to that question. I think when you look at local authority managed leisure centres, which is what Tyneside, Plimpton Pool, the Life Centre are, they nearly all have subsidies from the local authority. So this is how it's been run. So, for instance, we are still paying a lot of the budget we spend. We're still paying service borrowing for the buildings and for updates and things like that. We've done quite well this year at getting grants to improve the energy efficiency, both of the Life Centre and Plimpton Pool. Of course, with things like Tyneside, which is part of the PAL portfolio, they are also part of the National Marine Park bid as well, which, fingers crossed, we hear about, and it's really positive this year, and that means we get extra money to be able to refurb the centre. So it is a mixture. And in terms of the money we pay PAL, we pay them to manage and deliver some of that sporting activity. And of course, as a company, they are looking at how they can increase their revenue. So, for instance, I know they've already had a couple of advertising pushes. After Christmas, they're looking at trying to get some more corporate memberships. So they're trying to increase their revenue at the same time as reducing and managing their efficiency costs. It's a bit of both. Leisure provision, I always find, is a really challenging role for local authorities, because we get measured through different ways through government about how active our residents and our citizens are, which is why we've got Thrive Active and we work with promotion and lots of other grants. But at the same time, it's not a statutory service. So it's a really, really important one, because sport and leisure and activities across the city is one of the ways that we benchmark. So if you look at all the development that's going on in Brickfields, for instance, although that's going to create this amazing sporting hub for developing sports people, it's also going to be a health and wellbeing hub, which will support the people around Devonport, which is one of the most deprived wards of the city. So it's a really interesting mix. So in terms of PAL, hopefully their revenue will go up, and over the course of a period, our subsidy will go down.
Thank you. And it's interesting you mentioned Brickfields, because my next question is actually about the corporate property portfolio and the amount of money we spend and in terms of renewing and updating a lot of the projects we have. And I wonder whether I could be advised as to what the contingency on what assessment has been made of construction inflation for the next year, and has that been built into the budget figures that we've got, and at what level, and is that across the council? Is that standard across all departments when they're looking at construction inflation?
I can answer for Brickfields in so much because it's a consortium that's being put together. I mean, it's Plymouth Argyle, it's Plymouth Argyle Community Trust, it's Sport England money, and a bit of Plymouth PCC money as well, that has been managed within that project. In terms of the wider question for the council, I'm going to hand that over to Councillor Penworthy just in case it is in his portfolio.
Give me hundreds of millions of pounds and I can spend it, is the answer to the question. I think there's always money you can spend on the corporate estate. We have the budget and we work within the budget. And on that basis, actually, the cyclical repairs and maintenance will be individually quoted, and then we will work out prioritisation during the course of the year. So, you know, the Guildhall, we're doing the external part of the Guildhall, we are doing in phases so that actually we're able to reflect those as they come forward rather than trying to project 2 or 3 years into advance. Similarly, internally in the Guildhall, it was built in, and we're now value engineering the quotes that we've received. So we tend to do it rather than saying, let's just up the budget by this for inflation. We know what the budget we've got is, and then we prioritise and go out on case by case tendering for work. But we have very good surveyors who give us ballpark figures in advance of that, so we're able to know roughly where we should be and how we do it. I know, for example, that I have here a figure which I'm not going to tell you because we've not yet gone out to tender for how much we think we're going to spend on ground stabilisation of the retaining bank at Mountbatten Beach next year. It's an important piece of work that needs to be done. We'll be going out to tender on it, but we have an idea of what that will be, but we've identified it as important. So I have lists of that sort of thing, so that we work it that way rather than saying, let's just up the budget each year, because the council doesn't have the budget to just up it in that way, sadly.
And my curiosity was actually about when projects are being tendered for, whether there is an assumption about the level of construction inflation, because construction projects notoriously go over budget, and where the contingency sat with the council to deal with that.
I think that's why in things like the Guildhall, I just talked to you about the fact that we're doing each of the phases of the external works phase by phase. If it gets to the point we can't afford it, then we won't have not done all of it, but there might be one bit that's shifted a little bit back. So we do it like that. So rather than the levels, therefore, of bill, actually, you know, the Guildhall and Tinside Pool are my two really big ones, and they're then broken down into projects and billed accordingly. The rest are smaller amounts. For example, you know, Fireside Bay, which I've already announced, we've gone out to tender. We know what it is going to cost us. That's all been built into that one specific thing, rather than it being built into an overarching budget.
Thank you, that's very reassuring.
Thank you. I have Councillor Harrison.
Thank you, Chair. My question's to Councillor Penworthy regarding homes. Obviously, we've got over 12,000 on the Devon Home Choice Register at the moment, and I see that we have sort of apportioned money for updating refurbishment costs of some of the 10 homes you were talking about, a cost of 20,000 per property. So that they can be occupied in 2024, which is really reassuring, because the sooner we can get people into homes, both those that are on Devon Home Choice, sort of have been on there for a while, but also those that are at risk of homelessness or have been put into bed and breakfast because they have become homeless. Is there any money that's been put into the budget or is able to be put into the budget to support social housing providers so that we can speed up the time levels it's taking them to be able to provide homes that we know are there but are not being occupied at the moment because they're not ready? You know, is there any way that we're able to work in partnership to support to get that moving, because that could make quite a difference. It's not going to make a difference of 12,000, but particularly some of our families that are, as you say, in bed and breakfast, which is obviously not appropriate for families with children in school, and make them more permanent in terms of their addresses. Thank you.
Okay, That's quite a difficult question because you've conflated and got muddled up lots of different bits. Devon Home Choice is for permanent housing. It is nothing to do with temporary accommodation. So the money we're putting into temporary accommodation is to bring forward temporary accommodation until people get housed permanently, which might or might not be through Devon Home Choice. So in terms of temporary accommodation, it depends on the market being available. And, you know, with the the Local Authority Housing Fund, there is money there. I think almost all of those have now been bought. In fact, it was ultimately not us who did the second tranche. It was BCHA, because they managed to do the first tranche very quickly. But that's temporary accommodation, not permanent, and therefore anyone who's homeless is going to be on the housing register. And I'm just flicking through at the moment because in May I said I was really concerned that 12,500 from, in 2018-19 it was 9,721. It then rose and I said, this looks wrong. So we did a review of the register, and at that point we said we would keep it rolling as a review. And that review brought the number down from 11,916 to 7,819. So in 2021, there were just under 8,000 people on the register. The numbers had risen, and we were all slightly concerned that, last year it was 11,302, then it's up to 12,500, and we have instigated another review, which will be a rolling review. This takes off the register people who've died, people who've moved out of the area, people who have found other accommodation and no longer wish to be on the register and haven't told us, so that we actually know what's really there. That helps us to plan effectively. So we've now completed that review and it'll be rolling from now on in, and that brings that number down to 9,005. That will have a cost saving to us because we're not managing 2,500 households on the register who are not really there, but it also means we're able to understand the housing market better. It also means that we are able to say between 2021 and today, the register has gone up by about 12.5%. And we know that is really factual. And that's a big pressure, but we therefore have better understanding. Now, the reason that wasn't in your packs is literally the numbers came in yesterday because we were doing the report and I didn't want to give you information that we weren't able to be fully cognizant of. So we are working. We then work with registered providers. Quite often the issue is viability, and we work with them to close the viability gap, but also the issue of getting contractors and contractors able to work through the whole programme can mean things fall through. And if they get a quote that is too expensive, they can't afford to deliver it, so they'll be value engineering down, and we'll be looking at, are there ways that we can fill the gap because everyone else has put everything in. Now, I can spend money on that, but I haven't got lots of money to spend. So depending on the accommodation, if it's general needs, it'll be 10, 11, 12,000 pounds. If it's specialist housing, it might be 20, 30,000 pounds. So a wheelchair unit will be more, but that comes out of the Housing Investment Fund in the capital programme, not out of revenue. And it's on a case-by-case basis. It will also be done if we've done the land release on what actual value we put on the land, because quite often we do a land release at a very low value in order to get more affordability, more social rent, larger family homes, wheelchair homes, supported housing. So we actually manipulate with the registered providers the land value in order to get outcomes that help us meet the housing need, because we know we need to do that. So it's a really complex bit on that. I hasten to say registered providers don't like sitting on empty properties if they can help it, because what they're then doing is sitting on an asset that isn't generating them the income they need to pay the borrowing on the asset. So it'd be like you having a mortgage on a house but renting a property rather than living in it, than leaving the house empty. We can't afford to do that. They can't afford to do that. So they do move properties forward as quickly as possible. And we are talking to all of them, and they are doing that. They want to do their bit in meeting the housing crisis as well as meeting their budgets, but where it is necessary on construction, we do support them financially. We have a £1 million partnership deal with Plymouth Community Homes. under Plan for Homes. We have one with Live West. Both of those will be reviewed this year as part of Plan for Homes 4. And we have begun discussions about other strategic partnerships where we will agree investment partnerships where our bits will lever tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds worth of investment in the city, at an investment of about £1 million to close viability gaps and to bring projects forward. So, we do our bit, but ultimately they're all organisations in their own right with Homes England grants, and we're all working together, and we do it through the Plymouth Housing Development Partnership, which they all pay for, so they pay for us to provide some of that development support as well.
Any follow-up on that? Thank you so much. Councillor Tuffin.
Thank you, Chair. I think my question's been asked, but I've got another one. Councillor Penberthy, we find ourselves in a homeless crisis, and you've talked about the complexity of dealing with these issues, and also some of the plans. And if you could give us a kind of idea of the timeline on some of these plans. But I think an important issue is, going back a few years, we recognise that we need to use homeless hostels, and we also recognise that that's not the best place to deal with people with a variety of problems, be it alcohol, drugs, mental health. And so historically, we recognised some years ago that the trauma impact of causing homelessness, and how this is budget interested is because if the homeless hostels break down, relationships do break down, and they move out, and that adds to your budget because it adds to homelessness. And my concern is, have we plans to deal with the historic problems we recognised about, if possible, not using homeless hostels? But at this moment, we're in such a homeless crisis that would seem to be almost impossible to deal with that issue. So if you could give me an idea about your thoughts on that, and indeed, if a homeless hostel does have relationship breakdowns, it does increase homelessness. So are you confident that because of the time lag that some of your plans are going to take, that by the end of this year, the homeless crisis will at least be manageable? Because I recognise it's not of our making, and it's probably government policy failures that we find ourselves in this terrible homeless crisis.
I think this is once again, a really complex type issue. Homelessness is much more than rough sleeping and someone losing a place in any form of supported accommodation, whether that be one of the bigger hostels or cluster flat type things, because obviously the Lifehouse in Devonport is a hostel, George House is cluster flats, which is a very different model, and then we have path supported housing, which are shared houses, which is a different model again. So there's a foyer, which is a different model again. So we have lots of different models of supported housing. Yes, we wouldn't want another Salvation Army building built. They wouldn't want it. The investment necessary to drop the Devonport Lifehouse and rebuild it is substantial, but they are thinking about it. We're talking to BCHA about dropping Raglan to rebuild Raglan as a better temp accommodation, which will increase units, and we've got other plans similarly. Those all take time because you then hit planning and build times. So those are longer term solutions, and we are factoring those into a plan that isn't just this year or next year. It is a longer term set of solutions. I think it'd be fair to say that the Alliance don't want people sleeping on the streets. And if a relationship is breaking down that they're not able to solve, they won't just evict onto the street. They'll work together and they'll work with us to try and find somewhere else for that person to go. So what we are trying to reduce with the Alliance is that, though that might bring a temporary bed and breakfast solution, but if we can get them out of night pay into other things, that's what we're doing. So that's why we've applied to the SHAP, just to give you some idea. In terms of young people, that's 65 bed spaces, where we've asked the government for £5 million of capital and £3.3 million worth of revenue over the next 3 years to manage support for 18 to 25-year-olds at risk of homelessness, or should they be rough sleeping. In terms of adults, we've got another 38 bed spaces and 10 flats or houses, with an £8.8 million capital ask and £2.6 million worth of revenue funding. Now, some of those are new builds, so they'll take a bit more time. Some of them are about refurbs, so will be a bit quicker. Some of them are about buying, so will be about how quickly the market can react to that. And when we're doing our budgeting, we are phasing in when things happen. We would like to see improvements to the temp housing stock we've got, and another probably 150 in advance of all the plans we've already put in place and announced, bed spaces coming up. So we are, or units coming up, because some of those will be family units. So we are still looking for some substantial growth in the temp housing market, pending the build of new permanent homes. If we then get shrinkage on the temp, what we're trying to do is future-proof by making those homes suitable for supported living or suitable to be general needs affordable housing in its own right. So we're trying to make sure that we future-proof as we hopefully get over the blip. But it is a really complex type one. I think we're confident with the figures we've put in that we can achieve that working in the partnerships that already exist. But yeah, we'd like to get rid of Devonport Live and Lifehouse and do something better with it. So with the Salvation Army, at the moment, we've not been able to do that. We have with Raglan.
I'm grateful. Thank you. Councillor Tibbetts.
Thank you, Chair. My question's going back to Councillor Dan. It might be interesting to get input from Chris and Giles on this one as well. So, as part of the budget, I asked specifically yesterday about staff in children's social services in terms of retention, as well as recruitment. I'm wondering across the whole council what we're doing at the moment to focus on recruitment and retention, as I know that's having a strong staff base is important to keeping the budget stable.
I'll give you a top line answer, which is for children's social services. That is all part of the Children's Social Services Improvement Plan. So I'll just put that there because there has been a lot of cross-council support going into that function, from business support and everywhere else. And in terms of across the council, I don't think there is a simple answer. I think there's a whole mixture of things. I think the fact that we've added to pay grades means that we can encourage people who are moving up the ranks to stay within the council. Looking at specialist roles, how we recruit people who are very, very difficult to recruit, how we can incentivise that. The fact that we've put apprenticeships onto the full scale pay wherever they are, because we have new apprentices coming in who are generally speaking on the lower grades, but we've also got high level apprentices, and we've got people within our workforce who are doing apprentices as well, so we can encourage them to stay. I think a lot of public sector is really, really struggling at the moment, and in fact it's an employees market when you talk to a lot of businesses. And I think as a local authority, we've been doing a lot about talking about the values of what the council is and why you should want to come to work in Plymouth, as Plymouth as a destination, as an opportunity. So that's my political response. And then for a more technical response, we'll go over to...
Actually, the technical response isn't going to differ too much to that. Thank you, Councillor Dan. I think, yeah, we've got to remember we've got over 300 lines of business, I think, in the council. And so you've got lots of different technical specialisms and general kind of people doing less technical things as well. Focus on children's. Actually, the turnover rate isn't as high as other local authorities. And I did a lot of work on this in my previous employer at Somerset when we came out of inadequate and ended up as good when I left. A huge amount of work with social workers there. We've got a good relationship with the University of Plymouth there, so our intake of newly qualified social workers is pretty good, and they tend to stay from what I've seen so far. What we have to do corporately is how we maintain, develop the council as an exemplar. And we do struggle hugely in terms of some of the pay increases we're seeing in the private sector and other local and other public sector bodies as well. Historically, we can't match, for example, the NHS and what colleagues there receive under Agenda for Change and doctors' contracts. So we have to do that in other ways, and so it's how we market ourselves as an exemplar employer, market ourselves to prospective and current employees as well. How we develop and celebrate the fact we are a flexible employer, absolutely essential given the profile of our workforce. How we bring young people into the workforce and returners to the workforce as well. So working with our communities there as well. So this is all stuff kind of go through my head at the moment that will develop more as we develop the existing people plan and look to how we position that in coming months and years as well. Apprentices, absolutely, it's going to be a huge focus of ours. It's already pretty good. We want to take it quite a few steps further. So we are. So there's a group of us currently talking about that as well, and we're really happy to present that work in due course. So yes, and I'll refer back to the previous question as well from Councillor Carlisle around sickness and turnover and how we focus on that, and again how we support our staff through all of that as well. So a number of different things. There's no kind of magic silver bullet that solves the retention problem.
I'm grateful, thank you. Do you have a brief supplementary? Thank you.
So, are there any particular areas of concern in terms of staff areas that we should be aware of at the moment when looking at the budget?
No, not in terms of the budget. I think if I'm honest, if I'm looking at my portfolio, we are looking at how what the job looks like for the Director of Resources. We do not have a customer service, customer focus IT lead at the moment. It's sort of it's been shared across CMT, and we've been out to market a couple of times, as people have sat on co-op will be aware, and we still haven't been able to, fill the role. So we are looking at how we can think about what does that look like to move it forward, because it is a role as Section 151 officer and as a Director of Customer Services that we definitely need. But it's not a budget risk, it's just a how do we move it forwards risk.
Chris.
Thank you. And just a couple of other things to add to that, more service specific. We are doing some focused work and obviously my developing relationship with our street scene side as well. And again, we're seeing the pressures from the private sector impinging on the prospective workforce there. And the broader children's services workforce, so not just social workers, but actually SEND, inclusion and such like, and actually how we're focusing recruitment and retention in those areas as well. So those are my personal priorities at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, we're coming to the end of the 2 hours allotted for this session, so I'm grateful. I have two speakers left on my list. Councillor Poyser.
Thank you, Chair. Just two questions for Councillor Dan, should be pleased to hear. So the first one is in relation to community centres, which would that fall under your portfolio? No?
Give me the question, and then I'll tell you whether it falls under the portfolio in terms of connectivity. Because it might not. It could well be.
It probably goes somewhere else.
No.
It's an interesting.
If it's because it could fall under Councillor Penberthy's. So I think you've got the right person in the room. It depends on the question.
Okay, we'll see where this goes. So. So obviously community centres play a vital role within our communities, and they've been involved and have suffered cost pressures as well, cost of living, rising fuel costs, etc. I was just wondering whether the administration has some sight over which particular community centres might be struggling, which might require some intervention and support, and is there an allocation in the budget to support community centres as a whole, appreciating that some of them are have different commercial models and maybe leased out to other organisations as well. It's more the oversight and risk.
That's not my question.
Obviously, we will look at the community centres we own. The support we will be able to be dependent on the nature of the tenure of the occupants and whether we run them or not. In terms of community centres generically, no, the council does not have a programme of generic support for community centres. We haven't had for a very, very long time, and it comes down to communities supporting the community centres that they have, or the community centres themselves in the way that they deliver activities and how they fund those activities, either through grant aid or through income generation. Now, I've visited a lot of community centres, up in Southway recently, a fantastic community centre we own, we run part of, and a community group runs another part of, and we rub along really well, and there's food co-op happening there and a community builder based there, but also a social enterprise. I think Councillor Harrison needs to declare a conflict.
Discussed it earlier and wasn't sure whether it would be. So yeah, can I just declare an interest as a community builder, please?
So at that point, we will work in terms of maintenance of the building, but what goes on in it will be the services that go on in it and how they fund it. At places like Frederick Street in my own ward, it'll be to do with the fact that it's our detached youth services, going out to community connections, using it together with some family support out of children's social care, and a bit of family centre coming out of public health and the well-being agenda. So, and there we will therefore make capital investment in order for all of those things to work well. If I was to talk about in my own ward, the work that Nudge, Leadworks, Click, Millfields, and I declare an interest, I'm its chair, do, the council doesn't explicitly fund those community spaces. So it will depend a bit on the relationships and our tenures in terms of people who are using our spaces. And if it's capital works, then that will be about when we then schedule those according to priority with other bits of the corporate estate.
Do you have a supplementary?
Only in the sense that it would appear to me, obviously, that the community centres are very sensitive to obviously the goodwill of individuals within their communities, rely heavily on sometimes on external funding, and I think you've highlighted a number of examples there as well. And we'll talk about capital investment in some of these sites. Clearly there must be some provision somewhere, depending on the relationship with those. And is that visible in the budget somewhere for community centres? Is that?
For community centres per se, no. In terms of those that we own and which we have a repairing liability on if we have a lease, which won't, if people have got leases, it will not tend to be our responsibility, then yes, we will, if necessary, invest. So we have improved facilities this year at the Tot Hill Bowls Club, where we spent £30,000. But we won't necessarily do lots and lots on the things unless, like Frederick Street, where a planning application has gone in around works which are capital works to do with service delivery and linked to community activity. So if you have a community centre that isn't ours, we won't be doing capital works on it. If it is ours, it'll depend on the lease. And then if it's our responsibility, it'll be put into the prioritisation list, and it might or might not happen this year.
Finally, I have Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. And it's really just to sort of sum up the debate that we've been having on this panel around homelessness, and to say to Councillor Penberthy and the team that tried to tackle homelessness that, all credit to everything you tried to do, You know, in the break that I had yesterday while attending this scrutiny, man, I popped over the city centre, and it's a very sad situation when you're seeing people lying around the street you know, it was probably about 1 o'clock. It's not, as a civilised society, we shouldn't be seeing that, and all that you can do is very much appreciated. Can I just ask one thing? Obviously, when the leader of the council and Councillor Lowry introduced the draft budget and the proposals yesterday, part of our remit is also to lobby government. So what would be your top priority from homelessness perspective of an ask of government to make this council and your job in particular and the staff that support you easier in tackling homelessness in Plymouth today? Because I think the focus is housing policy has failed, quite frankly, in recent years, because homelessness has just been getting worse, and to have so many succession of housing ministers is disgraceful. But you know, it's not good, and it's not just down to the council to deal with this. We need outside support. So what would be your top priority of an ask, please?
So we have been told that the local housing allowance is going to rise. Last year at budget scrutiny, sadly, the proposal to lobby government on that a year ago was turned down by the then majority group. And that was quite sad because that was lobbying lost at the point that the LGA was lobbying for it. We've now been told it will rise. We've not been told the cut-off point. If the cut-off point is 18 months ago, there's not going to be a lot of difference. If it's 12 months ago, there's going to be a bit of difference. If it's now, there's going to be a lot of difference because that's the way that rents have been rising. So it would be really helpful to know very quickly when the government is going to set the time for the LHA rental sort of period to be assessed against, because that will make a lot of difference. And actually, to do that with today's rents would be the really ideal thing. That brings a whole load of properties back into affordability for lots of working people in the city who are receipt of, you know, in the old days of tax credits, now the UHP top-ups or the UC top-ups. Homelessness funding is very short-term and stop and start and not strategic. So we get little pots of money arriving through the course of the year to suddenly do something, to switch work on and off. Now with the Alliance, we're managing to do some of those bumps. It would be really helpful for the government to take a long-term funding solution here that isn't just about a bed for someone to sleep in, but support as well for the work to ensure that they can maintain a home in the long term. The work that we're doing through Complex Lives is really important because what we're trying to do is turn people around to be able to maintain long-term tenancies as active members of society. So it'd be helpful if the funding was long-term and was a bit more holistic. And on the short term, we've had the advantage over the last few years of the Household Support Fund. Initially, there were 2 tranches of 6 months, and then we've had 2 tranches of 1 year. In the budget debate, Stephen Timms asked the Minister whether it would continue, and the Minister said, yes, of course. However, all of the briefings from the Treasury at every level are saying that the Household Support Fund is going to vanish. Now, that really does have a very big impact on prevention of homelessness. And if I just flick through, the sorts of things that we've been paying for out of that are the free school meals vouchers during school holidays, energy advice and dealing with energy debt, other benefit advice dealing with debt. So PEC and Citizens Advice as major partners and their ability to support people. We've done stuff with young carers, we've done stuff with PATH, we've given money to Community Connections to actually make sure that they can try and keep people in places. So the garden shed, the sofa bed, the bunk beds. So actually having the household support fund for another year would be really important because the cost of living crisis hasn't gone away. So I think there you go, LHA, long-term funding and household support fund.
I'm glad you came to a conclusion. So those are your top three asks.
That's it.
Because Councillor Nixon will discuss these, as will the rest of us, in terms of lobbying. Do you
Well,
have a
Well, I
supplementary?
was only just thank Councillor Penberthy for his advice, and certainly hopefully the panel will take it forward. But I think it is important that, notwithstanding we should lobby government, we need to equally lobby our local members of parliament.
I'm grateful. That was a very good session, 2 hours. Thank you so much for your time and your responses and answers. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for your attendance. Members, that's the end of that session. Perhaps going to propose a brief break, 15 minutes, so back at 11:45, please. Thank you so much.
referred to a missed opportunity in reference to a lobbying letter concerning local housing allowance that was discussed at length last year during budget scrutiny. There was a vote on whether to send such a letter. The vote was lost, and therefore it didn't make our recommendations from last year's budget scrutiny.
I'm grateful for that clarification, and I'm sure your diligent record keeping will reference that accordingly. Very warm welcome, Councillor Coker and Councillor Brydesdale. Thank you so much for attending. In respect of this session, before we commence with your presentations, councillors, perhaps just for the benefit of everybody in the room and those watching online, Paul, if we could start with you and just do with brief introductions, please, and work our way around to the table to Anthony. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Paul Barnard, the Service Director for Strategic Planning and Infrastructure.
Mark Coker, Cabinet Member for Strategic Planning, Infrastructure and Highways.
Hello, Tom Brydesdale, Cabinet Member for Environment and Climate Change.
Good morning, everyone. Philip Robinson, Service Director for Street Services.
Morning, Anthony Payne, Strategic Director for Place.
Thank you so much for attending. Members are... Oh, sorry, Philip. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Such an impact. Thank you, Philip. Giving you a second opportunity there. Before we commence the task of scrutiny, I'm over to you, Councillor Coker and Councillor Brydesdale. I'm not sure who's going to lead in terms of your presentation. Great. And then we're very keen that members get lots of time to ask very important questions. So I hate to stymie all the fabulous news you're going to share, but I'd like to leave as much time as we can to deal with questions. So thank you so much. Over to you.
Understood. Thank you, Chair. There's a few things I want to say about both sides of the portfolio, just to give a bit of a financial overview to begin with. So if we could start off with the street scene side of it. Environmental services, which includes both environmental planning and street scene, is one of the largest departments in the council, comprising nearly 500 staff, a gross budget of £41 million and a net budget of £21 million. The largest element of that is our essential street scene and waste services, which stand at £8 million net. And that, of course, includes waste, recycling collection, street cleansing and grounds. Some areas, such as the garage, bring in sufficient income. So in that particular case, £1.9 million to cover their own expenditure. We've particularly been working with environmental planning to continue to drive up the council successfully accessing external and national pots of funding to deliver some really exciting nature and community projects. Their income was less than £1 million in 2022 to 23. That went up slightly to £1.1 million in 23 to 24. But next year, we're currently projecting a significant jump of £1.9 million of income in 2024 to 25. Last year alone, environmental services contributed over £4 million towards budget savings across the year, which of course does have a cumulative effect and means having to manage a tight budget. But despite that challenging context, we've delivered statutory services to over 123,000 households, 365 days a year. A new garden waste service to over 26,000 households. Award-winning green estate management that sees 40% devoted to nature and 60% to people. We've created the first habitat banking vehicle, developing 3 sites here in Plymouth. And we've also turned our commercial waste service into a profitable enterprise. Looking ahead, we're going to be lobbying the government more to confirm funding for some of the most significant changes to waste collection and disposal through the deposit return scheme, extended producer responsibility, and of course, food waste collection. So to move on to the climate change side of the portfolio, throughout this year, we've been working hard to deliver on the Net Zero Action Plan. We've put climate and nature at the heart of decision-making through the Climate Impact Assessment Tool, which applies to all key decision business cases. We've been focusing on green investment, jobs and skills as a central part of our corporate plan, and that's very much reflected through key performance indicators that track the level of our investment in net zero infrastructure projects, as well as the material reduction in tonnes of Scope 1 and 2 CO2 emissions. We've expanded carbon literacy training across officers and councillors, and I'm personally collaborating with every department, cabinet member and senior officer to ensure that the climate emergency is owned by us all across the council. The scale of the net zero investment challenge is huge, but we are making good progress. This year and in recent years, we have successfully secured over £111 million of grant funding for a range of net zero infrastructure and sustainable transport projects, delivering a total investment of over £200 million. We've also been using the planning process to good effect, securing over £5 million for carbon offset and net zero funding from the Section 106 and Community Infrastructure Levy process. The Council runs a Climate Emergency Investment Fund, and I was disappointed last year that the previous administration cut the revenue budget from £250,000 to £200,000. Instead, this administration is proposing to restore the ratchet, more than doubling the revenue spend to £450,000, which will support at least a further £2 million of capital investment on our own net zero projects. Looking ahead, we have an ambitious pipeline of another £250 million of low carbon projects and a further emerging pipeline of £35 million. Look forward to answering your questions later on.
Thank you. Councillor Coker. Thank you, Chair. It's nice to be back at budget scrutiny, but on a different end of the table, I must say. First of all, I think everyone knows the areas that I'm responsible for, but I'd like to just highlight some real initiatives that we've succeeded in over the last 6 months. For example, we've now established a Plymouth Enhanced Bus Partnership with operators, the first time the city's had that one. We had a visit from the Department for Transport, the bus section, to look at the work that we're doing and the importance of the bus industry to Plymouth, and that resulted in a 1.6 million grant for a 2-year period to maintain and enhance the network that we've got. Previously, we got 0 from that fund, so I'm really pleased that we've done that. We've also completed, over the 2 administrations, the Mayflower Street improvements, which is now up and running, which is making bus accessibility and pedestrian access much, much easier. We've also been successful in our active travel fund this year, which is enabling us to deliver more safer school street programs. We have another 2 coming online at the end of this school term, and another 2 in the pipeline for future projects. And we've won the money to be able to do that over the success of the ones that we've already run. We've also, on Active Travel Fund 4 awards, just been told that we've won £2.48 million to develop schemes such as Ponsonby Road Crossing, an Eastern Corridor Strategic Network scheme to improve the Colesdown Hill that was started originally. We had some good news that Plymouth was the best local authority in the country at delivering cycle training for children. In what year was that, Paul? In year 6, which is great news for the city, that actually we're working with our colleagues in education to make sure that this is done. We've also completed our 377,000 workplace travel grants, which is working with employers in the city to be able for them to implement sustainable transport measures in their area. Community transport is a worry in the city. Last year, some money was taken out of their budget, and both Councillor Aspinall and myself were working with Access Plymouth on ways of making them more sustainable going forward. Concessionary bus fares Last year there was £500,000 taken out of our concessionary bus fare. That worries me going forward, because at the moment Plymouth is comparable to national figures, where the concessionary fare since COVID is around the 65% of pre-COVID levels. And to take money out of a budget then with that is acceptable if you look at it like that. But as the concessionary fare and the elderly people come back and have got more confidence in our bus industry and want to get out, but it's not only about that, it's about health and well-being as well for these residents that need to go out and access. So that's going to be something that we're going to have to watch really closely going forward. Also, I think it's worth pointing out that Plymouth is now the vice chair of the Peninsula Transport Board and also the chair of the Rail Task Force. So that I've already had meetings with both Network Rail and operators and put forward quite strongly our vision for Plymouth. Also, I think I'm not going to go on too long. I've got lots more. And I just think the other area of my responsibility is highways maintenance. We have done a lot of work in highways maintenance, looking at how we can do more for the equivalent in budget. We've got some exciting new things to introduce next year, which will be able to cut both our carbon emissions and our use of electricity, and thus reduce the bills that we're paying. I'm gonna reintroduce the Living Street budget for councillors, because I think that is really important. Officers and myself are working through it at the moment, because if you look at how it's been spent, because it was me that introduced it all those years ago, some councillors are pretty active and make good use of the money. Some of it is not used. So I think we need to just reevaluate how that process works and bring it back. So it is included in our budgets. You won't have a line for Living Streets, but it is in our ability to bring it back, and you have my commitment that it will come back next year, and happy to take any questions on any of the areas. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you both, councillors, for the updates in respect of the successes, and notwithstanding acknowledging the savings that had to be made last year, the impact of those savings, as it's always difficult to do that. Members have loads of questions, and the list will continue to grow. Members will avoid, distilling that down to ward work. We're very keen on the impact of the budget, the draft budget that's before us, and in turn, we'd be grateful if you could give members a direct response as possible, because we will no doubt have a lot of questions for you. So I open it up, and first on the list is Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and welcome to our panel, and thank you for the introductions, both Councillor Brysdale and obviously Councillor Coker. If I perhaps come to Councillor Coker first. So the last comment you made is a very positive and welcome news that Living Street's budget will be again reintroduced next year. So I think it's an action point that I think Scrutiny should be positively welcoming that news. And the theme I picked up with the leader yesterday of trying to involve all councillors in activities of the council and Living Streets is key. So thank you very much indeed, Councillor Coker, for that. But moving then to highway maintenance, and I believe recently the government have indicated some additional monies for highway maintenance. Can you give some indication of sort of the value and whether perhaps moving forward we've concentrated on minimal resources in recent years on the primary trunk road network, principal network? Can we see hopefully next year more attention being given to residential roads where there's indeed lots of concern from residents? Shall I list them all, Chair, as the areas, or do you want Councillor Coker to?
I'm happy that I allow members one or two questions and then we move on. So maybe you just deal with that one and then I'll return to you. In terms of, if Councillor Coker answers that question, then I'll come back to you. How about that?
Thank you, Councillor Nicholson. It's nice to have a little bit of plaudit for a decision that I've made. What I would say is, as you're aware, for those new councillors, all our roads are professionally monitored and evaluated, and we get a road condition survey of every single road and pavement in the city on an annual basis. The government have, you're quite right in saying, given some additional monies. But what I would say to you is the overall figure that's being made public by the government is a substantial amount of money. But actually, when you whittle that down to local authorities, I can say that Plymouth has got 366,000 this year and 366,000 next year. And I'm quite happy to quote that because I looked at the figures before I came in to this meeting. So the kind of rhetoric about we'll be able to do miles and miles of roads and resurface is I'm trying to be quite polite, is not the message that is coming from the funding, but nevertheless, any additional funding is what is important and greatly received. What we have to do is maintain the HMET policy, highways maintained at public expense, and asset management plan to tackle the roads that are in greatest need. I am acutely aware that we are maintaining our strategic and resilient networks to a reasonable standard. But we do have to look at residential areas because and I think all wards can actually say they've got bad roads in residential areas. So I think what we will be sitting down and doing is looking at a certain amount of residential roads whilst maintaining our strategic and resilient network. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, thank you. Through you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Coker. And I suppose there's an ask, potentially no recommendations, that we should be seeking more investment, both from the government, but in perhaps the budget around highway maintenance. So thank you, Councillor Coker, for that. Just a couple of other points for Councillor Coker, if I may, before I ask Councillor Bryce-Dell a couple of questions. So just confirmation, Councillor Coker, that there's no, in next year's budget, no anticipated increase in or introduction of car parking charges in district shopping centres, Devil's Point, Jenny Cliff, and some of the other places that the last administration published and then quickly rescinded. So that's that point, hold that. And in relation to section 106, which I picked up yesterday, again with the leader and Councillor Lowry, there's about £11 million, as you'll be fully aware, sat in Mr. Barnard's coffers on schemes that we would like to actually see implemented, but clearly, obviously, priorities and so forth. But the point of the question is that a lot of those relate to very local schemes and impacts from development. Could we give a higher priority of trying to programme, in a reasonable time, the commitment and spending of that money and the involvement of ward councillors where they're significant enough that there should be some local consultation? I'll use an example. St Mary's playing fields, when I was sat in your post back in 2017-18, there's like £250,000 to do drainage works. The fields are so bad that the football team are now having to play at Lee Moor. So there's some small scale schemes that will bring real benefit, and I hope that we can make some traction, and you give a commitment to make some traction to try and implement those schemes in the capital programme. Thank you.
Right, on the first one, am I intending to put car parking charges in places that car parking charge is not? No. Am I intending to put the additional charge in our car parks, etc., other than the policy that was introduced for inflationary rises last year? No. As for Section 106, it's a real topical issue for me because both Paul and myself had a long conversation a few weeks ago about the monies that's sitting in Section 106 and also the importance of making sure that councillors have an input into that. So we are going to reintroduce a Section 106 updates for all councillors so that they will be able to see what's there, more importantly. But I know Paul is itching to say something on this because there are legal technicalities around this, as you quite well know, Councillor Nicholson.
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, the first thing that is important to say is that obviously Section 106 money isn't free money as such. It relates to mitigating the impact of development, and without boring you with the details of Regulation 122, it has to be necessary, directly related and fair and reasonably related to the scale of development. So there is a legal context. It's important to say that. Having said that, we produce what's called an infrastructure funding statement. We're required by law to produce that. It will be published this month, so you'll see the latest in terms of what we've secured through both Section 106 and Community Infrastructure Levy SIL funding. And of course that covers a whole range of different types of infrastructure, drainage through to affordable housing, through to improvements to children's play areas and play parks and all sorts of things. Councillor Coker has referred to the commitment to reinstate a report that we used to produce in the past, which will be a 6-monthly report showing all Section 106s and their status, because obviously it's constantly moving as more planning applications are determined. So it's literally changing on a day-by-day basis. So that will be something that ward councillors can interrogate and raise any questions. And I know some councillors do that quite regularly. It is important to say, and I don't know the precise details of the specific example, but happy to look into it. Sometimes Section 106 money is secured as part of a wider package. And there is a policy in the joint local plan that talks about maximising the benefits from Section 106, which often will be aligned to other funding streams. And our success, you heard yesterday a whole range of, and indeed today, a whole range of grants and funds that we secure from other sources. We often link Section 106 monies to those grants. So in other words, it will often be the case that the Section 106 money is not the full project cost for a particular improvement. But I think the challenge is a good one in terms of making sure that we are getting that secured money out there to make the improvements that they were intended for. So welcome the involvement of ward councillors in that, and happy to look at that in terms of the practicalities in more detail.
Through you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Coker and Paul for fulsome responses, and thank you for the direction of travel that you're proposing. Can I just then turn to Councillor Brydesdale on a couple of points? I'll shut up then, Chair.
There's a lot on the list, so
Huh?
I'll be grateful. There's a lot on the list.
I appreciate that, but hopefully this...
Back in later, if you're brief here.
It's very brief. So one of them is to congratulate Councillor Brydesdale on holding a session at which all councillors are invited to talk about a mop-up session on grass cutting. And certainly Councillor Brydesdale's listened intently, from the evidence, to what's being said by councillors generally, that more money's needed to improve the quality of grass cutting. So well done on proposing 300k of additional revenue support towards grass cutting. And I think Scrutiny, Mr. Jago, should be welcoming that additional money and investment. So thank you. So there's no question, but congratulations if we can get this through in February. But what I would like to touch on is what we touched on earlier, is about unauthorised encampments. Because unauthorised encampments, when Councillor Penberthy was answering this point just now as the Cabinet Member for unauthorised encampments, that the impact is felt by departmental organisation departments. And I would suggest, Councillor Brydesdale, that your your area is the area probably most affected by unauthorised encampments on green space. So my question is to ask you to take away the issue that we should probably have some centralised budget provision for dealing with the impacts of unauthorised encampments, rather than expecting the Street Services Department and Parks in particular to fund an unknown risk that's going to occur at the time we set the budget, which can have a disproportionate impact on your ability to deliver park services and cleansing and so forth in other areas. So I don't have to give a commitment now, but I would like you to take away and work with your cabinet colleagues, and I hope Scrutiny can recommend this, to look at some additional support on a pressure point that always has been existing in recent years, and which is having a disproportionate impact, particularly on the parks budget. So that was one thing, the other point there, and hopefully you will agree to do that. Thank you, Chair.
I'm very grateful, Councillor Nicholson. I'm going to save you from responding to that at the moment, because the recommendation we're going to capture, Councillor Nicholson has made a recommendation in terms of how that budget is illustrated, whether it's a line or whether it's its current position as it comes through other departments. But we're going to make a recommendation in respect of that as a result of this. Next on my list is Councillor Blight.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Councillor Bryce-Delve. As you know, I recently took part in the carbon literacy programme and thoroughly enjoyed it. My question is, I'm pleased that it's being rolled out across the council. How do you think this will aid financial decision making for departments in the council, and at what cost will the carbon literacy programme be?
Excellent, thank you, Councillor Black. I'm really pleased to see the large number of councillors that were involved in the most recent phase of that. We're also planning to a further set of sessions in January. I'm really glad to see lots of councillors already signed up to that. So the carbon literacy training is something that's been in place for about a year now. I was involved in the first cohort of that on a cross-party basis with some Conservative colleagues as well. I think it's a really central part of making sure that the climate emergency is right at the heart of everything we do. And it's fair to say that some people, both officers and councillors, feel like some of the scientific aspects of this are something that they don't necessarily have from previous knowledge. And I think it gives a really good foundational knowledge to that. But this needs to be about action and not just thought. And it's been really interesting to see some of the pledges that individual councillors and officers have come directly from their carbon literacy training. Some of the work we're already doing around the Net Zero Action Plan, there's some additional commitments that we're looking on putting in there next year that have directly come from councillors who've gone through that training and had some really wonderful ideas. There is a financial aspect to this because Emmanuel Marshall, the low carbon officer who leads it, obviously we're prioritising her time to deliver this training, and it is a commitment from different council departments to be offering up their staff for what is quite a lengthy period of time, which takes away from, on those actual days their operational duties. But to this administration, that's a really key part of making sure that understanding increases, and I think we'll already see that impacting the investment choices of different departments as we continue to roll it out. I also want to say about the longer term ambition of that. We're working towards getting a silver accreditation as a carbon literate organisation, and we're reviewing progress against that just to make sure that is really widespread across the organisation itself.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Poyser.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions, I think, for Councillor Bryce-Delve, but however Mr Robinson might like to interject at some point as well. So my question, first of all, just like to again thank Councillor Coker for the reintroduction of the Living Streets Fund. Hopefully this spells a bit of a shift away from, or more of a shift back towards ward councillors having much more involvement in decision making and how money is spent. So I suppose my first question really is, Bryce-Delve, is that it was around rationalisation of services and optimisation of services, not just with
with waste collection itself, but also other types of services such as street scene, parks, grass cutting, etc. All of us want to see improvements in those areas as well. And obviously we welcome the opportunity to provide feedback on grass cutting. That's fantastic. But anything we can do to streamline, optimise, rationalise, provide improvements to local services, even if that means more localised based work as well. So decentralising some of our work as well, and combining the role of individual services as well. Has any work been done on that in preparation for this budget, or is there any work planned or time in this budget for next year so we can release any savings or benefit the year after?
That's a really good question, and it also touches upon how often with climate emergency related innovations, it's not necessarily about having to spend a huge amount of money, it can also help to save money as well. So within my own portfolio, one of the examples of that is around route optimization of refuse vehicles, and we're doing a very data-led approach to making sure that is in the most efficient way possible, not just in terms of the use of fuel, but also the carbon emissions that will save. As Cabinet member responsible for climate change, what I'm doing is going directly to every single Cabinet member and senior officer. So we're constantly having those high-level conversations about what every single department can do around that. And so trying to make those kind of improvements not just a climate change thing, but something that we all have that sense of corporate responsibility for. I don't know if Philip, you wanted to add anything more to that?
Yeah, thank you, through Chair. Councillor Poyser, no, it's a really good point you raise. We are undergoing a programme of modernisation, and we are looking at ways in which we can use a workforce that was reduced statistically in the last 10 years. I would argue that the demand is increased. We have looked at combining roles, and we'll continue to see where we can make savings in terms of combining those functions across the service over this next year. Yeah, we that and combining the use of new technology is something we'll be majoring on this next year.
Thank you. I do have one other question, if that's okay, and that's in relation to waste contracts as well. Just wondering whether there is any budgetary implications for waste contracts next year, i.e. are there contracts coming up for procurement which might impact upon the budget, and has that been taken into account? That's disposal and or collection.
So there are various contract negotiations happening at the moment. We've involved that with regards to BIFA, the recycling facility. We've been involved in that with regards to our garden waste collection, and there's also been contract conversations happening with the energy from waste plant as well. So those are alluded to within the budget that's been presented to today. Again, Philip, happy if you wanted to add anything else to that.
Thank you. Councillor Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Councillor Coker. I just want to congratulate you, Councillor Coker, on the money that's been awarded for the bus improvement service plan. To you and to all the other officers, that's a lot of money. My question is that going to be ring fenced for bus transport? And what is the advantages the people of Plymouth are going to see because of this money?
Thank you, Councillor Murphy. The BSIP awarded to us is contractually from the DFT to this council to spend on bus services, bus service infrastructure, and we have to report back on how we have spent it. People will see we've introduced the first new route on the Peveril, Drake and Compton area, which was funded through that. With our bus champion, because I'm sure everyone in this room knows that I take bus travel seriously, and I've introduced a bus champion, a councillor, whose role is to be the go-between between the bus companies, members of the public. We are setting up a panel with residents. So if there's anyone listening that would be interested in joining a panel to talk about future developments of the bus industry in Plymouth, I would encourage them to do so. That will be going out early in the new year. I think it is worth talking about the bus industry in general at the moment. The bus industry is struggling nationally. Rural areas, there's 40% less public transport routes now, not in Plymouth, but nationally, that there was 10 years ago. And I think that is worrying for communities. Part of the BSIP structure is about connecting communities with the places that they need to go. A lot of work and research is going on behind the scenes to ensure that we are able to safeguard the network as it is at the moment and for future developments. Now, I was at a meeting yesterday with the Peninsula Transport Board, and we are hopeful that the next round of BSIP funding will be confirmed shortly, and Plymouth will be taking an active role in that to ensure that we protect and enhance our bus industry.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further? Councillor Tippett.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Councillor Briers-Delve. I was really excited to hear in your opening remarks about the increased amount of budgetary money for the Climate Emergency Investment Fund. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on how that will support the council and if there's any risks within the budget in increasing that fund.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Tippett. So some of you will be aware of this particular fund. So this started from an idea that Councillor Dan had as my predecessor a few years ago, and it was something that subsequent administrations supported and was done under various cabinet members. We've delivered some really exciting projects as a council over several years as part of that, including some really important work in terms of decarbonising our estate. We're very aware that buildings are a huge cause of emissions for us as a council. With any form of borrowing that comes from large funds, we need to make sure that we have revenue that helps cover the interest of that. And it got to a point where a lot of that initial investment had been spent on capital projects, and last year a decision was made to slightly reduce the revenue cost for that, which essentially made it harder to be looking towards new capital investments as part of that. And one of the exciting things about this fund is it helps us to accelerate investment in renewables, in energy efficiency, and we need to make the most of mechanisms to do that. So I've been working with finance and the climate change team in terms of what might best allow us to do that. And so the increases from a current 200 grand revenue budget for that, increasing that up to £450,000, that will allow at least £2 million of additional climate change related projects to occur, which will be a central part of what we do for the next few years going ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Riley.
Hi, thanks, Chair. My question is to Councillor Briers-Delve. Obviously, it's getting cold, as everyone knows. I feel the cold, and we're in a cost of living crisis. I was wondering if there is anything by way of investment in homes, energy efficiency for homes in the budget, please.
So this is something that obviously crosses between my portfolio area and Councillor Penberthy from a housing and communities point of view. And I think this is one of the most important questions that we can be asking, particularly this time of year. Like I said earlier, there are often co-benefits to climate change related work, and we're very conscious of the rise of fuel poverty. When we go around knocking on doors and you hear people who've putting up paper on their windows to try and insulate it in as cheap a way possible, and people really crying out for support. I could spend an hour talking about some of the projects that we're working on around energy efficiency. Don't worry, Chair, I won't. But I just wanted to give some of the examples, particularly around the partnership working, because this isn't something that the council can deliver by itself. So I wanted to do a shout out to Plymouth Energy Community. I sit as a trustee on their trust board. They do some incredibly important work. We've worked directly with them to secure an additional £3 million of grant funding solely around providing insulation and clean heating improvements, which is being rolled out as we speak. We've also worked out with the social housing providers, so particularly Plymouth Community Homes, but also Live West. Some of you will be aware of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which has provided £17 million so that we're retrofitting hundreds of our social homes across Plymouth, which is a great way of channeling that additional support into the homes that need it most of all. We've also been working with neighbouring local authorities as part of a consortium to be providing energy advice to all households across the city, trying to make that really clear through social media channels, but also our website, so that everyone has the best advice about how to make their homes as energy as efficient as possible. Thank you.
Councillor Stevens.
Thank you, Chair. This is for Councillor Brydesdale as well, please. I've got two questions. The first one is, I can see in the budget plan that there's a forecast to invest in the Cheltenham Meadow solar farm next year. So what will be the impact of that investment cost-wise, and savings-wise, and on the decarbonisation of Plymouth's homes and buildings?
Thank you. So what we're trying to do as a council, and this has been a couple of years in the making, is we want to deliver one of the biggest community-owned and led solar farms across the country at Cheltenham Meadow on a patch of land which, because of its historic use, couldn't be used for other means. That's part of our wider ambitions to completely change the way in which we're accessing energy as a council. So by the end of next year, we want to be in a position where the majority of the council's electricity comes through renewable means, which is a very different ballpark to where we've been over recent years. By 2030, we want to have 100% of the council's energy coming from renewable methods, and solar is going to play a huge part in that. It's going to cost approximately £15 million of investment from the council through borrowing, which is covered in the pack. In the long term, this will lead to savings for the council. It will take a few years to get there, and I think both parties over recent years have agreed that those decisions need to be taken to make sure that we're as efficient as possible in terms of how we access energy as a council.
And a second question is, I noticed the investment as well in the grass cutting budget, as you've seen, as well as hopefully for a reduction in casework for councillors. What will it mean for residents when they walk around?
So I've spent quite a lot of time this year talking about grass cutting, and I think when I picked up the role, I was looking forward to talking more about renewable energy perhaps, and I think it's fair to say that all of our inboxes have had grass cutting emails, and I want to be completely upfront about that. It's worth looking at some of the historic issues around that area. So the grounds team has had over a 10-year period approximately 35% cuts, and obviously there are impacts on what is delivered in terms of what the public see within that national austerity context. But we pledged, as an administration, to really listen to residents and councillors across the council. And as much as I could try and stand up in every single council and try and answer questions around grass cutting, we need that investment. And the budget that we received in May from the previous administration didn't cover the level that our public expect or what we want to deliver as councillors. So I have been pushing for an increased budget in that particular area. We've currently factored in an extra £300,000, which will make a difference. So that will relate both to staffing, making sure that we've got teams available to be looking at cemeteries, doing that as well as possible, but also around play parks. I'm a dad with a 2-year-old. I felt a huge amount of empathy hearing about some of the families that were kids struggling to get to the swings and that side of it. And this will allow us to continue our pilot of an increased grass cutting regime in play parks. So on both of those sites in particular, they'll notice a difference. Across the whole city, this is just about making sure we can deliver on our policies that are currently in place, which has been a stretch this year. But it's in response to the feedback we've had from the public, it's in response from the feedback we've had from councillors, and I hope we'll see a more efficient service as a result next year.
Before bringing in Councillor Rainsford, just staying with that point, 300 is around the table, general consensus, very pleased to hear that. Would you like more? Because you talked about delivering the policy. So is 300,000 sufficient to deliver that policy, or is there a further ask for more?
So 300,000 represents approximately a 20% increase on the previous grass cutting budget. I say approximately because the way that the grounds budget is managed is that it's looked holistically across. And so, that represents a huge increase already. I'm hopeful that will help us to deliver on our policies as they are in place. Thank you.
I'm grateful. Councillor Rainsford.
Thank you, Chair. Ocean City Nature, to Councillor Delve, have received a £500,000 loan from Street Services. Now, having attended the carbon literacy courses, I'm very well aware just how difficult it is sometimes in the public eye to link nature projects with financial benefits. I think most people think they have a cost rather than the benefit. So could you talk us through how that particular investment is going to benefit the city financially? And are there any other examples?
It's a great question, and what Ocean City Nature is doing is absolutely country leading. This Plymouth City Council was the first local authority in the country to set up some form of habitat bank. This has come about through changes in the Environment Act, which essentially obliged all new developments as of next January, so in a few weeks' time, to deliver at least a 10% biodiversity net gain. Obviously, we all know from our experiences in the local authority that new developments can risk having a negative impact on nature, and what that law is attempting to do is to make sure there's a positive benefit to local wildlife. We're aware that we're in an ecological emergency. In full council recently, I shared some of the stats around the decline in various types of species, and that's really alarming. So what Ocean City Nature will allow is us as a local authority to harness that legislative change and make sure that Plymouth benefits. One of my concerns around that legislation is that developers will be quite canny in where they drive that investment. There might be a little bit of game playing around the metrics. They might try and channel that towards cheaper areas to do biodiversity improvements that maybe communities won't benefit from. And so working with the environment planning team, so under Philip's direction, but also Kat Deeney and Chris Avant, who've done some amazing work in this area. What we've done is give an initial loan to Ocean City Nature of £500,000. That will allow us to do enhancements on free trial sites in the city. What then happens, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, is that using the DEFRA metrics, we'll have to measure the biodiversity improvements on those sites, and then developers will be able to purchase what are known as biodiversity units. So that's a way of trying to quantify the change. They don't in any way own that land. They're kind of theoretically purchasing the improvements that have happened on that. And so that has as an opportunity for us to bring in some quite large sums of money through this vehicle. The initial 500,000 is to do the proof of concept and show that we're confident in this approach. The hope in the future is that we'll be rolling this out at other sites so that we can look at more wider approaches to green investment on a much larger scale.
Thank you. I've got one very short question for Councillor Coker. It is short. How cost effective has Velocity been? I mean, its work rate's obviously prodigious, but how much is it saving sort of per pothole, if you've got those figures?
I've got a set of figures that I will share with you. Under the Southwest Highways contract that we had before, an approximate, and it is approximate because each pothole's a different size and a different depth, was approximately 45 to 48 pounds to fill it. Under the velocity machine, it's the equivalent to between 15 and 20. So that is one measure, but also one of the other measures that Councillor Brydesdale and myself are working on is the velocity machine actually has less of an impact on our climate and our carbon measurements. So what we're trying to do, and the company that provides this data are working on it, so by the end of the year, we will be able to demonstrate how many, and I hate the word potholes, Councillor Rainsford, if we could use road defects, that would be really more, that would be better, because a pothole is a defect and there are defects everywhere in the road system. But we will then be able to measure the effectiveness for the climate emergency and our net zero action plan, which will be the first time that we've ever been able to do that.
We've all learned something today.
Thank you,
They're
Chair.
not
I
potholes,
promise
they're
not
road
to mention
defects.
potholes again. I've got a third question, which is about street services. Do you want me to come back later with it? It's a very straightforward one, really. Looking at the way waste is collected and fly tipping is dealt with, over the years, it's clearly become more efficient. Are there new ways of working, particularly around perhaps fly tipping? Because as a councillor, I've discovered, you know, you report one bit and there's sort of 3 or 4 bits in the vicinity. Are there ways you can look at dealing with those slightly more efficient?
So that's actually one of our most recent changes to our street cleaning approach. So what previously happened is that a councillor or a member of public through the self-service would report a particular example of fly tipping. The team would go and collect that. Policy that we've introduced over recent months is that if a resident or a councillor reports a bit of fly tipping, particularly around back alleys, then the entirety of that back lane will be checked and other items will be collected as part of that. Sometimes there are challenges to that, so if they don't have the appropriate vehicle to collect other pieces that weren't anticipated, then they would have to return. But hopefully that helps to streamline that as well. We're also looking at making a change which we've trialled in September, which is looking around neighbourhood street cleaning as well. So I think it's really important to make sure that staff have a local pride and ownership of their areas, and there are certain hotspots across the city where street cleaning is more of an issue. Lots of you will be particularly passionate about ones in your own wards, I'm sure, and so we're looking at a few different neighbourhoods that have particular issues with street cleaning, and essentially appointing individual officers to be responsible for that particular area. So it won't necessarily happen in every single part of the city, but it will be data-led on those areas that we have most issue.
Grateful, thank you. Councillor Harrison.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions. First one is for Councillor Coker. It's regarding the park and ride fees. There's a line in there saying about introducing fees. Is that for bus companies that use the fees, or is it back to what was being suggested last year in terms of charging a nominal fee or a fee for users of the park and ride services across the city?
That was in there because that was a budget line from the previous administration, where I believe you wanted to charge for people to park there. No, but it was part of the budget cuts. What I've asked the team is over the next few months, we are going to be doing a total review of park and ride operations, because there are different models, Councillor Harrison, run up and down the country. So what we want to do is establish the best way to manage a park and ride site, because obviously there are plans, I believe, for Devon to put one on the edge of your area. And what I'd like is for all of our park and rides to operate and run in the same way. But what I won't do is, until we've done a review of all park and rides before we make a decision, because it's got to be best value for money for both the council, the operators, and the travelling members of the public.
The second question for Councillor Brydesdale. You mentioned earlier on the waste facility over at Western Mill, and I just wondered whether or not there's any any money put into the budget for a waste educator in parts of the other parts of the our area, such as Devon, Torbay, waste educators supporting schools to encourage our sort of more carbon literacy, and whether or not that's in the budget at all, or is being considered in the future.
So there isn't a particular line in the budget solely around waste educators, but we're very interested in this topic about what we can better do around waste engagement. So I work very closely with the Energy from Waste facility. They have staff in place who do a great job in terms of making sure that schools are better aware of this. So I recently attended the Incinerator Liaison Committee, and I was speaking to the staff there about their figures and how they can better reach out to schools. So making sure that we're using the education forums, the fortnightly letter that goes to head teachers, the forums that are in place for head teachers, so that they're aware of that opportunity. But every year, there are hundreds of pupils that go through that, and I've been quite impressed by the quality of their education around that. This is also a kind of partnership approach more widely as well. So in terms of what we can do as a council to encourage schools to be really pursuing this as well. A couple of months ago, we had Recycling Week, which is part of a national campaign. I want to see our recycling rate go up as a city, and I think as a former teacher, I'm always looking towards that next generation to be leading the way on that. So I worked with Councillor Cresswell for us to contact every single school in the city, giving them some resources that were created nationally from Recycle Now, and encouraging schools to be part of that too. So I think with something like this, it's going to be a joined up approach. We're looking at our own council resources around that as well. So we've been working with the comms team at the council to do a recycling engagement campaign, which will be launching in the next couple of weeks. We signed off a press release last night, which is going to be solely focused around Christmas-related waste. It's an exciting time for giving and receiving, but with that comes a huge increase in waste and the need to be thinking not just about recycling, but about reducing and reusing as well. And I'm sure all of us, amongst our families, be looking at ways to do that, and we wanted just to encourage residents to be part of that thought process too.
Thank you. Councillor Carlyle?
You'll be delighted to hear, Chair, that both of my questions have been asked and satisfactorily answered. I'll sit back and relax.
Wow, we should note that. I have Councillor Bingley.
Not the case for me, Chair, so thank you. Right, I've got a couple of questions. I think they're probably for Councillor Brydesdale, but I can give them a go. I just want to pick up on a point. It's really good news that various things like the Living Streets funds are being reinstated. I do want to amplify that. Last year was an abnormal budget. It was a 37.5 billion deficit. We picked up a 15 billion deficit from the previous year as well. So therefore, just to correct some terminology, there wasn't an anti, sort of local democracy thing. It was an abnormal year, which is why why we put forward abnormal policies to just deal with that year. So I'm glad you've kind of reset things, but it's great you can play sort of Santa Claus on the success of our budget last year, basically. Right.
Chair, I don't think that's really appropriate.
Well, hang on a minute. We do politics for the last 2 days, so let's just get to the question.
Yeah, okay. Politics has been done by both sides now. So, okay, my first question is around sort of port strategy. Now, there is a perception, obviously, that shipping is kind of you know, sort of not particularly sort of progressive in terms of sort of climate change and carbon reduction, etc. That perception is not right, by the way. You know, there's been huge amounts of sort of progress made by people sort of manufacturing boats, etc. I just want to check that within the port strategy, that the attempts or the manufacturing, sort of the green-blue economy and the manufacturing, sort of the environmental friendliness of manufacturers is sort of encapsulated or sort of assessed in some way in the port strategy. So the port strategy is kind of picking up on carbon reduction by particularly sort of shipping manufacturers or the types of shipping coming into Plymouth Sound. Because we're also, at the same time, we are meeting to discuss clean water, aren't we? You know, on the sort of growth and infrastructure committee. So when you're talking about port strategy over the last couple of days, can we ensure that that is basically aligned, that there is a serious sort of carbon reduction strategy or policy within that? So the second thing was around severe weather. I see here sort of flood risk management, and it's probably for Councillor Brydesdale, and I didn't want to ask it in like a civic defence way. I wanted to ask it like for practically, can we have in the budget, or is there sort of a severe weather event sort of emergency rehearsal for this city led by the council? Because I think we're very good on paper-based risk management, but I'm not aware, and I might be remiss here, but I'm not aware of us sort of every year doing an actual physical, like council-run severe weather event emergency rehearsal, like multi-stakeholder thing. Thank you.
I'll bring Anthony in on your first one in a moment. So the port strategy is overseen by the economic development team as opposed to place, so they'll be better placed to discuss that in detail. But just to touch on the climate emergency related points in there, so you're correct to say that in terms of freight of goods, that actually there are carbon emission benefits of sea-related travel for that compared to heavy lorries on the roads, for instance. And so there's certainly that dynamic there, and I've had that conversation with the Catwater Harbour Master, who's very passionate about making sure that argument is heard. As I've said before about trying to make sure the climate emergency is at the heart of every topic we do, whilst Tudor and the economic development team are working on that particular strategy, I'll be sure to be looking at ways that this can be informed by the climate emergency debate more widely. Anthony, is there anything more you wanted to add on that particular?
Yeah, just on the port strategy, obviously that got raised yesterday in economic development session, or the introductory session. That's a piece of ongoing work which has just been commissioned. You heard yesterday linked to all of the Freeport debate and discussions about the advances we're going to make with Mill Bay. We will also, as part of that Freeport strategy, look to see how the lessons from that can be then passed across to all the other port facilities within the city, in particular Catwater. So we're talking with the Catwater Harbour Master about that, early days, but it's something that we'll definitely bring into the debate and the discussion. And it links back to not so much our NZAP as a council, but the citywide climate change agenda and challenges that we are working in partnership with a range of organisations on. So it's a well-made point, Councillor Bingley, and we'll make sure that the linkages are made across departments and with partners externally. Obviously, there's a cost associated with it, and we'll try and utilise funding that we've got through Freeport and so on, and it will be dependent upon available funding streams to be able to implement and so on.
And who's dealing with the second question about the flood risk management?
Well, I think we do a lot of paper-based scenarios. I agree with you. Highways always do a flooding severe weather preparation task every year. But I think that's an idea that we could take forward. We're always open to new suggestions. And I think there is room for discussion on that topic, Councillor Bingley. So I've got no problem with that. But what I just wanted to also say is in relation to what Anthony said on a port strategy for Plymouth, the Sub-Regional Transport Board have also launched their strategy for ports in the whole of the region. And I think it would be worth, for anyone that's interested, it would make really interesting reading.
I'm grateful. I have two further questions. Councillor Nicholson, and then I've been assured that Councillor Stevens is, you indicated a small one. I don't think you were having a go at me, you were just saying a small question. So, Councillor Nicholson, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and hopefully it won't be too long. Just two points, really. I think the first one's probably more Councillor Coker, but it's more of a strategic question. So you supported ably by an excellent team behind the scenes, have been delivering some really key strategic infrastructure projects. So I just wanted to talk really, or ask a question around next year's budget. Is there sufficient revenue support for some of those major capital investments to maintain our progress in delivering some of those key schemes, please? So that's the first question, and I'll come back to the second one.
The answer to that is that all schemes are being reviewed constantly and monitored, Councillor Nicholson. As you know, inflation and the cost of raw materials and labour have gone up greatly in the last 18 months, 2 years. We have not scrapped any schemes. We are reviewing them. They are important to our strategic path on the city. And at this moment in time, all I can say is we are pressing ahead.
Thank you very much. And through you, Chair, to Councillor Brydesdale. So in terms of climate change, there's a constant, obviously, challenge on all of us to improve and also to take the recommendations of the latest COP round of negotiations internationally. But looking at the medium-term financial strategy, so you've talked about some, 200,000, 400,000, but in terms of the medium-term financial strategy, are you planning in more substantial investment to ensure we meet the challenges of climate change in the sort of medium longer term, please? Thank you.
Yes, very much so. So, I know you mentioned about 100,000 here and there, but, I covered earlier that in the last few years, Plymouth City Council has secured and delivered over £200 million worth of investment in low carbon projects and sustainable transport more widely. So, thus far, the council has tried to drive a significant amount towards that, and we need to be increasing that. So in order to achieve net zero as a council, it is going to take, huge amounts over time. But what we currently have with the increase in the Climate Emergency Investment Fund will help us to deliver that. And we're working on major bids as well from external providers, which will help increase that too. So that's already in hand. We're also aware that the net zero can't be met just by Plymouth City Council. Plymouth City Council is only responsible for about 1% of the city's emissions. And so we also need to be looking out to major employers through some of the partnership works that we do to make sure they're reducing their own emissions as well, and the public as well. So making sure that we use the Climate Connections website and our low carbon officers who regularly attend public events to be spreading those messages that will help us get there as a city. So yes, we continue to look for large sources of investment to make sure that we reach our commitments on that as a council.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Stevens.
Okay, Tom Brydesdale, please. It's going back to what you said about the tidy up neighbourhood teams, which is great, and you'd hope that for those areas that are repeat offenders, regular occurrences, it'll promote a bit of civic pride. But where's the line drawn in getting value for money if they repeatedly go to those areas? And where's the line drawn for kind of penalising people more so who are committing the fly tipping and mess to start with?
So this will be done linked up to environmental enforcement. So they're slightly different parts of the portfolio. So we have the street cleansing and the fly tipping teams whose responsibility is to collect that, when that appears. Which in an ideal world, it wouldn't in the first place, but that's their responsibility. From an environmental enforcement point of view, the council gives out fixed penalty notices. So sometimes it could be hard to identify who has done what and when in terms of collating that evidence. We do give them out relatively regularly for fly tipping offences, and I'd recommend councillors who are active on social media following the Environmental Enforcement Facebook page, which gives very specific images and examples within particular neighbourhoods, and it's quite a good thing to share as well, so that the residents who might be tempted to do that, or businesses, as it often is as well, have that sense of, you know, that there will be repercussions if caught. Particularly on the, you mentioned about the littering side of that as well, we also have the ability to do that. The difficulty is catching them in the act and having that evidence, but there'll certainly be a two-pronged approach to making sure that we're improving that street cleanliness in both ways.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much for your attendance and for your responses to the many questions. Greatly appreciated. You are free to go. Thank you. And as soon as you leave the room, we'll start talking about you. So. Members, please avail of a 5-minute break, but I'd really appreciate if we came back straight away, because I just want to talk about timetabling and how we conclude matters. So by all means, 5-minute comfort break, and I'll see you back here then. Thank you so much.